Okay, so we are now live, and so let's go ahead and get started. It's great to see everyone here again for day 2 of the philosophy of mythology in the continental tradition. And today we are going to begin with our first keynote lecture by Stefan Niklas. I just want to briefly introduce Stefan, and then we'll get started. So Stefan Niklas is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. And I think, Stefan, you've been there since 2017, right? Around 17.
Yes.
Right. So around the same time that I came to Hong Kong, about a year later. He's had postdocs at the University of Cologne and Oxford University, and his PhD was at the University of Cologne in 2014. He specializes in philosophy of culture and aesthetics. And recently he's been working on mythological consciousness and its relation to aesthetic expression in popular culture. And that clearly connects with his presentation today. So we'll be able to see some of the fruits of that recent work of his. He's published an edited volume on the philosophy of Ernst Cassirer, which I'm happy to possess. And he has a book publication entitled Die Kopfhörerin, Mobiles Musikhören als ästhetische Erfahrung. And he has a number of papers on aesthetics, Dewey, Cassirer, pragmatism, philosophy of culture, and others. I won't go through them all now, so we can cut to the chase here. The talk today is entitled Cassirer, Star Wars, and the Aesthetic Transformation of Mythical Consciousness. So without further ado, Stefan, you have a good hour for the presentation, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion.
Well, thank you so much. I am very happy to finally present this, and I'm truly honored that that you invited me to do so, and thanks for the organization. I will now have to put you on a different screen, so I might look like this, but I'm looking at you then, and I will change this for the discussion again. So I will present to you a condensed and preliminary version of the project that I'm pursuing under the working title Redisenchantment, Aesthetic Transformations of Mythical Consciousness. So this overall project tries to develop a theory of the dynamics of mythical consciousness under conditions of what I loosely call post-20th century pop culture. So philosophically, I depart from Cassirer, obviously, but also from Adorno, whose philosophical programs are pinned against each other to create certain, theoretical tensions that help me to think about these problems and to develop a phenomenology of mythical consciousness in dialectical terms. Now, Adorno will be largely absent today. I will focus on Cassirer, and as far as the post-20th century pop culture is concerned, I will be talking about Star Wars. Now, if you do not know anything about Star Wars, go ahead and Google some of the images whenever I refer to a thing called a lightsaber or so. If you, however, you know a lot about Star Wars, well, I'm happy to be grilled on my interpretation of the details in the discussion. Okay, so what I will do is, after a brief introduction, I will try to give the general outlines of the project of a phenomenology of mythical consciousness in Cassirer. I will try to briefly describe the function of myth as symbolic form, as Cassirer calls that, being, or mythical consciousness, there being a form of thought, a form of intuition, and a form of life in a specific sense. I will then turn to some specific motives or characteristic themes of mythical consciousness, which I will then tie to examples from Star Wars. Before I make my overall claim about the autonomy of myth and its aesthetic transformation, I will then return to why Star Wars is an exemplary case for that, and hopefully conclude on something. So let me start with just a very general introduction of Cassirer and myth, about which he has written extensively, and to describe the corpus of text that we're dealing with here. It is next to the second volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, now titled in the English translation as Mythical Thinking. It used to be Mythical Thought, mythisches Denken anyway. That's from 1925. There's also a lengthy study from the same year called Language and Myth, which is quite important for me. And there's a text called The Form of the Concept and Mythical Thinking from 22. And this is largely the period in which Cassirer has written a lot on myth as a symbolic form, which he discovered, say, in the 1920s as vital for his overall project. And he will then later return to myth in the 1940s under, well, I should say, obvious conditions that made dealing with myth relevant from a political point of view. And it is his posthumously published The Myth of the State, which is, I think, his most popular book, as it were, loosely picked up by philosophers like Chiara Buttici and also Jason Stanley recently to explain how political myth works and how fascism works and these kinds of things. So I'm not going to give an exhaustive reconstruction of Cassirer's philosophy of myth in terms of its internal development. Rather, I will offer an account of the concept of mythical consciousness as, firmly based on a condensed interpretation of all these texts, if you will. So I'm treating this as if it was one thing. I'm aware that there are slight differences in the development, but for the time being, that is not really a problem, I think. So what's a project called A Phenomenology of Mythical Consciousness? Now, by using the term mythical consciousness rather than just myth, the phenomenological character of Cassirer's project is highlighted. But the kind of phenomenology that Cassirer pursues concerns the different modalities of human consciousness and their respective objectifications. The primary model for this is Hegel, as Cassirer admits on more than one occasion. And he relates his project also to the contemporaneous version of phenomenology, that is the phenomenology by Husserl. The main difference, however, between Cassirer's and Husserl's conception is, in very short, that Cassirer does not pursue a pure phenomenology, but instead the phenomenology of culture, which is not trying to lay open essences, but seeks to reconstruct the dynamics of the various forms in which the human consciousness actualizes itself. So while Cassirer and Husserl share the transcendental attitude, Cassirer does not aim at the purified version of consciousness, but instead investigates the conditions of the different possibilities in which phenomena are, in his words, well, impregnated or imprinted, bestowed or saturated with meaning. It's always a problem how to translate symbolische Prägnanz, pregnance, pregnancy. The connotations in English and German are different, to say the least. So Cassirer's inquiry into mythical consciousness is, to give it something like a title, is a transcendental phenomenology of the dialectical process of myth as a basic mode of the human understanding of the world. So Cassirer is not actually pursuing a philosophy of mythology, but a philosophy of myth as a philosophy of mythical consciousness as a modality of human consciousness altogether. So the double reference to Hegel and Husserl is in fact indicative of Cassirer's dual perspective, which not only connects the transcendental with the dialectical, but also the investigation of the modalities of consciousness by which the world is apprehended, with that of the modes of objectification or objective spirit in Hegel's words, or Hegelian words, by which the human world is manifestly constructed. So apprehended and constructed is the duality here. Because these are the polar aspects of the investigation of any symbolic form. So religion, language, science, art, history, etc. would be other examples. But consciousness can be studied only through its expressions, so Cassirer holds. But these expressions, in turn, can only be understood according to the function of which they are the expressions. So admittedly, my distinction between modalities of consciousness and modes of objectification is unfortunately not quite as clear-cut in Cassirer himself, but I believe that it captures analytically what he presents materially in his comprehensive studies. If you know the Cassirer style of writing, you know that he's not exactly a friend of watertight definitions that you then could work with, but I'm trying to add this in a way. So conceptually speaking, symbolic forms are the encompassing forms that each entail the modality of consciousness and the modes of objectification. And as I will point out later, this distinction between the modality of mythical consciousness as an autonomous function and the modes of cultural objectification, this is then vital for the understanding of the transformations of myth. Okay, so since mythical consciousness can be known only by studying its expressions, philosophical inquiry must look into those, as it were, coagulations within the current of mythical consciousness that allow to make its general form intelligible. And the material for such study must be gained empirically through historical, ethnographic, linguistic, sociological, and so on, mostly comparative studies, to help understand the structures and the genesis of mythical consciousness through such particular cases. So Cassirer thinks that the systematic task then of a philosophy of myth, however, consists in determining the encompassing principles of the activity of mythical consciousness. And this is really a distinctive feature also of Cassirer's approach, which recommends it highly after almost a century, that he actually manages, I think, to avoid hypostasizing one of myth's characteristic features, say the narrative aspect, as its sole principle. Okay, so while Cassirer, also in the tradition of Marburg-style Neo-Kantianism, believes that philosophy always relies on the sciences, as he says, I believe that philosophy is nevertheless itself capable of pursuing material analysis of concrete phenomena, concrete configurations of human culture. So this is why I will use the example of Star Wars as not just an example, but really an exemplary case for inquiring into the transformations of mythical consciousness today. Models for this material kind of philosophy are, of course, not to be found in the Neo-Kantian tradition, but then rather in, early critical theory, Simmel, Benjamin, Krakauer, and of course, Adorno. I believe, moreover, that we actually must turn to pop cultural phenomena, as we can no longer base our analysis on the same kind of material as Cassirer and other scholars of his time. Because mythical consciousness is not about other groups of people, it is about us. Obviously, you can always ask, okay, you say it is about us, but who is we? And whose situation is this anyway? How can you just assume such a collective we? And my answer is, I don't know. But the point of that kind of critique is that any investigation into myth should be self-reflective and thus should be about us in a generalized sense, not although, but precisely because we cannot and perhaps never can fully determine who we are or who we are supposed to be. I believe that only this way can myth be truly recognized and understood to be the persistent modality of human consciousness that Cassirer claims it is. So you see where I follow Cassirer, or the point to which I follow him and where I would like to depart from him. So the second part of my talk is then about the function of myth as symbolic form. And I will now try to briefly lay out how mythical consciousness constitutes a form of thought, a form of intuition, and a form of life in a certain sense. Well, Cassirer's leading question here concerns, as I said, the function of myth within the whole of human culture. And what Cassirer calls a function is, however, not so much the instrumental role that something plays for reaching a predetermined goal, but rather its specific style of functioning, a way of operating that creates its own ends. And this notion of function concerns basically the way in which relations are being established according to operative rules that may not always be strict, but in any case, relatively stable. So this is Cassirer at his best, trying to explain how something emerges, but also how the inner logic of it works. And this is what he calls a function, the mode, a style or mode of functioning. And Leibniz is the model for that in the background. Or not even in the background, he's quite present in Cassirer's texts. Okay, As a form of thought then, or thinking, I have no preference in terms of the translations. Thought is fine, I think. But as a form of thought then, myth concerns the production of the categories which order the intellectual interaction with the world. So Cassirer discusses the logical character of the mythical kind of object consciousness, Gegenstandsbewusstsein, before examining some individual categories. Cassirer states that the categories of myth are not of a different nature than those of the empirical sciences, but of a different modality, which is why I feel, which is why I feel this concept of modality should be expanded, because here Cassirer uses it explicitly. So these are different ways of coordinating things and organizing experience. Cassirer considers especially the categories of part-whole relations, of properties, causality, and similarity. And to take causality, this is as much a mythical as it is a scientific category. Yet the principle according to which effects are related to causes in mythical consciousness are that of concrescence or coincidence. Greg mentioned this in his opening statement. And this is quite different, of course, from determining correlations according to general laws, as in the sciences. So the principle of concrescence, meaning that which grows together, or coincidence, meaning that which falls or simply occurs together, this principle generates units, say of cause and effect, not as synthetic units of differentials, but as original units of identicals. So this principle of concrescence or coincidence does not only apply to causality, but to all categories of the mythical consciousness. Yeah, in negative terms, you could say that, that this means a lack of abstraction, whereas in positive terms, it means strong integration or total participation of the parts of, all the relational aspects. Turning now from a form of thought to a form of intuition in the Kantian sense of Anschauung, mythical consciousness means a specific way of experiencing space and time, and number also, because Cassirer conceives of number as a form of intuition and not a concept, and a mythical consciousness that makes a lot of sense. So the mythical modality of apperception constitutes schemes for the, well, again, Leibniz terminology, for the order in togetherness or juxtaposition and the order of succession. So space is ordered in mythical consciousness as the here and there, according to different zones of being or precincts, which are traditionally referred to as sacred and profane, traditionally in the philosophical literature, I mean. In Star Wars, by the way, you can see this quite clearly, because there you have a desert planet, you have a forest moon, you have a swamp planet, and so on, and you can travel from one to the other, and you have entire worlds made of the one thing, of the one zone of being. Time, on the other hand, is ordered in units of temporal intensity of past, present, and future, say of the ancestors, the living, and those to be born, as part of the same continuous presence, which is largely devoid of any sense of unidirectional flow. Furthermore, the mythical consciousness refers to time as the realm of immutable origins that provide reasons in terms of justifications. In other words, or in Cassirer's words, time is the why of things. Also in mythical consciousness, the orientation in space is prior to the orientation in time, since time is not yet, of course, this is a teleological formulation that I should avoid, but it's not yet an abstract relation, but again, concrete coincidence where the now is a here and the then is a there. I skipped the aspect of number. I'm just saying that, the things that can be counted and the counting numbers in mythical consciousness are undivided. Well, as a form of life, then, the third aspect of the convergence of what makes mythical consciousness, as a form of life, myth organizes the social order, and it does so, again, by way of concrescence, which here means that signs, animals, directions, persons, spirits, artifacts, and all else constitute the Cassiras' words, fundamental and indelible solidarity of life. End of quote. So solidarity of life is Cassiras' formulation, and I think very apt formulation for describing this mythical form of life as an animated whole where individuals in the strict sense, as well as the concept of personhood, are not given. That they are not given does not mean that they would not emerge. They do so. But to cut short a longer discussion that Cassiras gives, the totalizing community of life usually claims the sacrifice of any gained selfhood. You can find this also in Horkheimer Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment. And of course, you can find it in Star Wars, where especially the Jedi and the Sith orders respectively claim the sacrifice of selfhood over and over again. Okay, I can now turn to some more specific motives of mythical consciousness, if I have now established the general outlines, at least, of how Cassiras conceives of mythical consciousness as a modality of the human consciousness with this three axes of thought, intuition, and life. And then now I really just pick some motives which I consider to be central for the understanding of the mythical consciousness, and already for understanding why Star Wars is an exemplary case. But I will return to Star Wars and the reasons why it is an exemplary case only later. These three aspects that I have selected for today are first tools, the status or role of tools in mythical consciousness, then the idea of mana, and the motive of death and the fear thereof. So tools, or more specifically weapons in mythical consciousness, can be imagined if you consider a lightsaber. So the weapon of those who are initiated or trained in the Force. And these lightsabers are green or blue when yielded by a Jedi, or red when yielded by a Sith. And for those who would like to discuss the exceptions to this general rule, I'm very happy to do so in the discussion. What's important here is that a lightsaber is a sacred weapon. It is both a sign and a tool which defines the character of that character who is capable and worthy of using it. It is thus a perfect example of the status of tools in mythical consciousness as described by Cassiras, because he says, I quote, "So the tool is never regarded as something merely manufactured, as something devised and produced according to capriciousness, but as a gift from above. Its origin goes back not to the human being itself, but to a savior, be it divine or animal." End of quote. But then he goes on to explain that that things that seem like produced, that seem artifacts, or actually are artifacts for our understanding, are simply received in mythical consciousness. And he says, quote, that this holds true for the technical tools of culture as well as for its intellectual tools. For in the beginning, there exists no sharp limit between them, only a fluid one, end of quote. Another way of explaining the general principle of coincidence or concrescence, which, as I will explain in a minute, is the identity principle, as Cassiras says. So this lightsaber may be constructed, and usually must be constructed, by individual adepts of the Jedi Order, yet the sacred knowledge to do so must be received, and the moment of assembling the weapon consists in a magical ritual that only instantiates the divine origin of the weapon. And it's very interesting that in the original Star Wars trilogy, the whole procedure is incidentally not depicted at all, but just cut short by having Luke Skywalker, the hero, receive the ready-made weapon, which is the weapon of his father, that's his ancestry, through the hands of his mentor and later his master, Obi-Wan. And this weapon is obviously made for lethal combat. It's designed to kill, right? But as Obi-Wan indicates, in a civilized way. So the fighting and killing are cultivated as sacred acts. And just like, this is Cassiras' example, just like an Aeschylus 7 against Thebes, a spear is itself the god, the sabers are direct manifestations of the Force and its powers. So I try to explain at the same time how Star Wars speaks to the mythical consciousness and how the specific motive of tools is important for understanding the mythical consciousness. I will now turn to the idea of mana, or the force, and the identity principle. So there are different ways to name it, but the one exemplary word that has come to serve as the general indicator of the all-pervasive force that connects things in the mythical consciousness is mana. It means an undifferentiated power, which serves as the general reason for things to appear at all. However, while mana is everywhere, it is not constant, but felt more intensely at specific places or specific times. And in other words, it is a force field which shows certain regions of concentration. So while to the mythical consciousness, such a force field is not a mere assumption, as in the sciences, but real and in this sense substantial, it is nevertheless not a single substance. So the impression that it was a substance, a thing-like object, does not stem from the mythical consciousness itself, as Cassirer points out, but rather from cognitive and linguistic habits of modern Eurocentric philosophy. Cassirer just says, our habits. And one might add that even the conceptual fixation on the very name mana, which is really a specific regional word from, if I understand this correctly, only parts of what was called Polynesia, but it has come to serve as in a generalized way as a concept which was introduced into Western anthropological discourse by a guy called Codrington. And now it is mostly in the Western literature that mana lives on, if you will. But if we accept the generalized conceptual status of the word and follow Cassirer's interpretation, then mana is, furthermore, not a fixed predicate, but it means a certain way of predication. And this is, in other words, a way of apprehending things by endowing them with significance, or more precisely with sacredness, against the background of the profane. So mana is that which makes things salient, generally expressive of the cosmic whole. And through mana, all things are animated and connected and thus take part in the great community of life. In short, mana is the identity principle of mythical consciousness as a single force. And one might as well just call it the force. And George Lucas did not really take chances when calling it just that in Star Wars. Obviously, this force of Star Wars is a simplified and fictional version of mana, which does not display all of its aspects. It is somewhat a hybrid of the magical and the religious aspects of the mythical consciousness or mythical thought, which, however, is typical for the dynamics of all mythical thinking. And while the force as such is impersonal, its manifestations and emanations are essentially tied to persons, to those in whom the force is strong, as is repeated in Star Wars over and over. And in these personalized manifestations of the impersonal force, Star Wars actualizes the idea of mana in a way that suits and reinforces 20th century pop cultural superheroism. Well, it simplifies the idea. It makes it a mere effect at times. It crosses the line to sheer stupidity more than once. But in all that, it is the reinstantiation of mana that I regret to inform you is simply adequate to our times. So this identity principle, the overall principle of identity, not only surpasses the rather simplistic version of the force, but also the whole concept of mana. Following Cassirer, it is the way in which the mythical modality organizes consciousness altogether. So if identity, therefore, is called the principle of mythical consciousness, this does not at all indicate a first principle as myth's ultimate foundation. This is not how Cassirer thinks in terms of principles. He rather refers to the identity principle as myth's general mode of functioning, again, its operative principle, which describes the inner systematicity of myth as a form of thought, intuition, and life. So I think this is kind of the transcendental attitude in Cassirer that Greg said that he would like to discard, more or less. Okay. So the point is that it allows mythical consciousness to order all things within a singular closed cosmos where everything has its place, time, and meaning. And in Star Wars, like in many other fictional worlds, this can be seen in the constant effort to close story gaps, to fixing the timelines, to adding the backstories, to get everything that has emerged along the way fully fitted into the cosmos. This is fantasy. The genre of fantasy mostly works like that. Well, to be clear, this is not just a problem then of narrative consistency, but on the contrary, when there is some prop in a scene in the second installment of Star Wars called The Empire Strikes Back, that can become its own character decades later, then we understand what the identity principle is about in these fictional words, mythically conscious fictional words, if you will. So there is this one prop that stands around, and it was just a clumsy thing, and now it is the assassin droid IG-11 in another series of Star Wars. The accidental things in the mythical realm of Star Wars cannot remain just accidental, but they always aspire to become essential. You can take everything, every detail, which is always already the whole, and spin it to become the most meaningful thing, since everything here is overcharged with meaning due to the self-referential closeness of the mythical cosmos, which in Star Wars has reached its pop cultural culmination, or one of its pop cultural culminations. That doesn't mean that everything is really the most important thing actually at every moment, but potentially it is. And it stays in a state of latency until its time, its season, and the double sense of the time of the year, and also the TV season, and its place have come. Finally, to understand the concept of the identity principle is to understand the fundamental role of images, since everything that is felt or thought within mythical consciousness is turned into images, and images can be pictures, images can be stories, and images can be melodies, super important for Star Wars. But these, I quote Cassirer, images in which myth lives are not known as images. So that is, they are not distinct from what they show: coincidence, concrescence, identity principle. The great process of distinguishing, say metaphorically distinguishing or numerically distinguishing, has only just started in mythical consciousness, and it is revoked, or mythical consciousness revokes its distinctions the moment it makes them. So this marks a great difference, as Cassirer observes, between the mythical and the truly aesthetic understanding of images, to which I will return because it seems to pose a problem to my case. But first, I will briefly address what may count as myth's definite problem, and that is the problem of death and fear. So this is the third of the motives that I selected to depict the mythical consciousness and tie it to Star Wars. Death and fear. If there is something that may qualify as the motivation that drives the mythical consciousness in terms of human needs, it is probably that of coming to terms with death and the fear thereof. In his late The Myth of the State, Cassirer calls death the greatest problem, which reveals the greatest strength of myth's power to organize the most deeply rooted instincts, humans' hopes, and fears. And he then summarizes that in mythical thought, the mystery of death is turned into an image. And by this transformation, he says, death ceases being a hard, unbearable physical fact. It becomes understandable and supportable. End of quote. This is very, very Cassirer in terms of the pathos that he puts into his formulations. And I think he probably just means that death becomes, in a sense, known and even worth supporting, because we can't change it, as it were. Now, Horkheimer, Adorno, to mention them anyway, have famously given further depth to the close connection of myth, death, and fear, and they have done so most probably under the unacknowledged influence of Cassirer's work. This is what Hauke Brunkhorst claims, and I have reason to believe that. Can't provide the evidence here, but just trust me, they have done so. So they state that enlightenment, Horkheimer, Adorno state that enlightenment is the radicalized mythical fear of death as fear of the unknown. The truly anti-mythological or anti-mythical attitude would be that of defying death, rejecting its sanctity and its immutability, not to be okay with death. That is anti-mythical. And this is captured in this metaphor of Odysseus forcing the gates of the Hades. And this is all very much in line with Cassiras' considerations, even if it's much more daring than everything that he would have ever said. And this is something that I will also try to explore elsewhere a bit further. What's important here is that in Star Wars, then again, death and fear are very prominently present. And yeah, I mean, the most iconic object of Star Wars, which is as simple a setting and a weapon at the same time, is aptly called the Death Star. It's really, you know, again, they did not leave much to the imagination here, if you will, or everything to the imagination. So, but just the brief comment on this, that one would be mistaken to think that only the evil Imperium, like, you know, the space Nazis, would be the death cult alone. They are a death cult, certainly, but the Jedi, the good guys, who officially try to prevent the dying and not bring it, they are nevertheless give in to death's immutable power as well, and they are constantly trying to keep the fear of death in check, since it leads to the dark side. And thus they just confirm fears and death, or the fear of death's determining status. There's a very interesting aspect in this whole Jedi thing, namely the technique to defy or seemingly defy death by becoming a Force ghost. Maybe you know this, that this Obi-Wan, who I mentioned, will then appear to Luke Skywalker, the hero, as a ghost. But strangely, this ghost remains conscious, remains an active member of the community. He can still move things. He can have experiences. And so, and all this as a part of the community of life while being dead. The idea has not been totally thought through in Star Wars so far. And well, Disney announced that the upcoming Obi-Wan series will say more about how to become a Force ghost. But the point is that Star Wars is also in this respect so deeply post-20th century mythical that it has this mantra, no one is ever really gone, which is repeated in almost every installment of the Skywalker saga. All right, so much for Star Wars for the moment. I now really have to turn to the overall claim of my inquiry about the autonomy of myth and its aesthetic transformation. So there is a debate in Cassiras scholarship that centers around the status of the symbolic forms as each autonomous and therefore irreducible to one another, while at the same time being somewhat hierarchically ordered. Now, I cannot go into this debate, but what is important here is that autonomy does not mean absolute independence, but quite the contrary, for the symbolic forms are pervasively interdependent in their dynamics as objective configurations, but they remain functionally autonomous as modalities of consciousness. So you see how my distinction here plays out. And just let me mention that configurations is my translation of Gestalt, or it is actually the translation of Gestalt that I have found in the literature, and which I think is a good translation, because Gestalt is notoriously difficult to translate. And I mean, sometimes it's even used in English as in Gestalt theory. The question is then how the functions of myth and art are interleaved, both as autonomous modalities of consciousness and in terms of more fluid cultural configurations. And my suggestion here is that myth, due to its own weak teleology, that is the way it develops and occasionally discards its own goals along the way, that due to this weak teleology, it must, so to speak, delve into other forms to sustain itself by transforming itself. Cassiras treats myth mostly as remaining where it was, after it has given rise to new forms when reaching its own limits, thus having prepared the stage for religion, art, science, and so on. So this is an important thing also in the Cassirer discussion, that myth is the somewhat original symbolic form, and then it is given rise to all the others. And Cassirer claims, yeah, but it stays in the midst of our culture. But then again, his philosophical inquiry leaves myth at this point until the late stuff on the myth of the state, because he thinks that, well, it is played out in terms of its function, its role in this sense within the whole of human culture. But this whole metabasis idea, the metabasis into other forms, as Cassirer calls it, this disregards the transformations that myth undergoes in its own perennial progression. But standstill would be the death of any cultural form, while we are aware that myth is very much alive. It does not only have a generic function for the other symbolic forms, as Cassirer insists, rather the impulses, configurations, and aspects of the modalities of other symbolic forms also have a regenerative function for the persisting mode of mythical consciousness. There is just no one-way road in the modalities of consciousness that shape and are shaped by the configurations of objective spirit. Cassirer knew that, but his philosophy does not come to that conclusion like explicitly and convincingly, I would say. And then the late Cassirer will notice with great surprise, not to say shock, that myth did return as instrumentalized by modern political techniques, as he calls that, or technologies. And his surprise confirms that Cassirer did not consider how the process of myth continues developing in new and different directions, but apparently thought of it as something that at best keeps rotating within its own closed circle then. And in this respect, the remaining teleological aspects of his philosophy, which is then not a weak teleology, have blinded Cassirer to the progression of mythical consciousness after its self-sublation, after the metabasis into new forms. But in contrast to his personal surprise, his philosophy had in principle provided exactly the means to understand that myth does not leave the human mind or the human cultural world, but remains an option. And this is not just an abstract option, but a real option. Therefore, the mythical consciousness keeps evolving and keeps integrating the impulses it receives in a world that has also art, or culture industry, if you prefer, history, science, as well as fascist politics and capitalism, of which Cassirer knew nothing, I'm afraid. Yes, it is specifically the configurations of art, and more broadly, the realm of aesthetic pop culture, where this autonomous function of mythical consciousness sustains itself and broadens its own possibilities. Or more pointedly, mythical consciousness sustains its function only by intermingling with aesthetic configurations. And that this is also true for the discussion of political myth. You can study in the works of, for instance, Chiara Buttigie. In other words, the continuous development of mythical consciousness includes an aesthetic stage, an aesthetic stadium, phase, or mode, just like, as Cassirer has shown, myth also has a linguistic stage in word magic, a quasi-scientific stage in alchemy and astrology. And these stages, which correspond with other symbolic forms, express the way in which they are interlocked, the symbolic forms in which they are interlocked. And this interlocking is possible because symbolic forms are always twofold in the sense that I have suggested, as forms of consciousness and forms of objective spirit. Therefore, configurations that on the conceptual level of objective spirit belong to art or the aesthetic can be imprinted by and provide a milieu for mythical consciousness. And of course, it should be clear that there is no mutual exclusion then of the two, but as forms of consciousness, they are naturally open to the world, because I mean, forms of consciousness are forms in which you can be conscious of things within the infinitesimal totality of things called the world, and which includes the products of other forms of consciousness, obviously. So, and only because they are each autonomous, they can ignite new possibilities in each other. Okay, to summarize this point, I'm not only claiming that myth remains an autonomous force within culture today, but that it can stay autonomous only because it connects itself with other forms of cultural configurations and the corresponding forms of consciousness. Due to their common orientation towards images, art shows the greatest affinity to recharging the vigor of mythical consciousness, as also Cassirer has noticed himself. Mentioning Hölderlin, which perfectly suits the research that a lot of you are doing on German idealism and romanticism and Schelling and so on. So mentioning Hölderlin, Cassirer alludes to the new possibilities of artistic expression for the regeneration of the original force of images, the Bildkraft, that now gains spontaneity. And I think Hölderlin's poetry is really a good example, especially as it reflects the differences in myths and arts orientations or respective orientations towards images, and thereby at least Cassirer hints at the way that art transforms myth by both depotentializing and liberating it. And this way, myth even gains consciousness of its images as images, or in this marriage, if you will, of myth and art. The consciousness of images as images appears, hence the aspect of conscious self-reflexivity. But unfortunately, this is about the only example referring to the aesthetic transformation of mythical consciousness that Cassirer could come up with. Let me therefore return to my example of Star Wars. And let me try to explain why I think Star Wars is such an exemplary case and some of its specific features that I think, recommend it. Well, I've been referring to Star Wars, hoping that you and I share some at least superficial knowledge of this massive global phenomenon. And I hope that in the meantime, you have Googled some of the images or so. I simply hope that that my references evoke such images. This is, of course, the first and foremost function of using such an example in a so-called material philosophy, that things should be made concrete, that is also confined to a field where things can be shown. The question is, however, or the question which I can no longer escape is, what is Star Wars after all? And how does specifically this phenomenon exemplify this whole transformation of the mythical consciousness? So now Star Wars is a major global franchise received all around the globe, but it began as a series of cinematic movies, a trilogy that in a way redefined what kind of effects could be expected from the so-called big screen. It also redefined what cinematic music could sound like, if it is not just the soundtrack in the background, but has a quasi-operatic quality where certain themes, like the famous Force theme, can appear like invisible characters. Its most accessible and entertaining iconography, which always prefers the trashy over the artsy, its tropes and its music have sunken deeply into pop and everyday culture, making Star Wars a significant configuration of the objective spirit of our time. That already is kind of the major reason why I think it is a good example. Furthermore, the Star Wars cosmos, by which I mean the overall world building and storytelling of the so-called galaxy far, far away, is expanding now across ever new movies and novels and comics and animated series and video games and Lego and of course the recent TV shows, as well as an almost unfathomable amount of fan fiction, including really some high quality movies, I must say, fan theory, fan comments, and reenactment groups even. So Star Wars poses certain problems to the definition of its genre. And this is also significant for the understanding of it as, accommodating mythical consciousness. So Star Wars is fantasy, that's clear. It takes place in space, however, so it's not like The Lord of the Rings. This makes it look like science fiction, which at the same time it is definitely not. So allow me to take a shortcut by simply positing that Star Wars is its own genre, which can be described as mythical space fiction. I really try to avoid the term science here, it just doesn't seem appropriate. Its constructional premise is the hybridization of different other genres and styles across the board of fantasy and science fiction and Western and samurai movies, or simply the eclectic mashup of whatever there was. If Star Wars is at all speculative fiction, it does not artistically speculate about possibilities of this world according to certain assumptions, the famous what if this goes on, or if only of science fiction, but instead it posits its own world to speculate about what happens if, say, a samurai would fight a cowboy, but then with laser weapons, while a princess comes along with a cute robot friend, and nobody has to, worry about oxygen, gravity, or toilets, not because the corresponding technical problems would have been solved, but just because these problems do not occur. So Star Wars may be an example, among others, to demonstrate how the mythical consciousness is accommodated and transformed within artistic configurations. But it is also more than that, because its exemplarity, that is, its ability to display the general characteristics in its concrete features, stands out. And this can be seen especially in the way it again establishes the identity principle in its world building, in its conception of time, and in the general way in which it gives images instead of reasons. So let me briefly say something about Star Wars identity principle. The cosmos of Star Wars is closed, and this is why I call it a cosmos, incidentally, and not a universe, as you can sometimes hear, and therefore bounded towards the outside, but infinite on the inside. The great success of Star Wars consists not so much in the stories it tells, but in its world building. Thus, the never fully determined setting of the whole, which allows to tell those stories in potentially infinite variations. So, and while now the Skywalker saga has come to an end, ever new installments, ever new shows are being produced, where elements are recombined, where new things can be introduced as variations. And according to this identity principle of a fictional cosmos, everything can be renewed as long as it stays the same. But the point is that the aesthetically realized identity principle of Star Wars not only works once the imaginary galaxy is there to be explored further and further, but it is also responsible for the very creation of the whole setup. So Star Wars was created through the equalizing connection, or the forced concrescence, if you will, of tropes and all kinds of things specific to other genres, without any attempt to conceal the sources from which they were stolen. But Star Wars gets away with this because its source material, so these motifs from, say, samurai movies in Western, are so neatly webbed together that they defy all attempts at reducing the whole to one of those sources. So the parts become invisible. The parts become expressive of that whole. This is really an amazing artful transposition of other fictional elements into a simplified mythological well, simplified is not even fair, but into an identity principle of mythical quality. So this can be studied in many occasions, and I'm happy to give examples also in the discussion. The general technique is to reiterate, to give variations, always with a sense of ironical self-quotation. To give this impression that things that are really stupid at first appear as if they belonged there right from the start. Everything has to, be confirmed as absolutely essential, as I tried to describe when talking about the mana principle. As far as the temporal structure of Star Wars, of the Star Wars cosmos is concerned, we are here dealing again with the variations within an eternal present. So there is so much talk about hope in Star Wars, which would evoke a sense for the future. But this hope remains completely abstract. It is at best, the hope to get away in time, to beat the evil guys, but there is no sense of fundamental change in the Star Wars cosmos, and there cannot be. There is 1,000 of generations of Jedi, but they are all the same. The order never changes. The technology never changes. The economy stays the same. And even the politics, there is at best some, cyclical recurrence. And just one more example, the droid R2-D2 became part of the rebellion because he was also on the side of the good guys in the prequels. So this is how these problems are solved. More importantly, and this is the aspect on which I want to conclude, is that Star Wars offers images where science fiction would have offered also reasons. And when Star Wars appeared, the whole art of science fiction was deeply shaken because Star Wars took its tropes and used the momentum of the success of space operas like Dune and Star Trek, the TV show Star Trek, to launch its assault on, nerd culture by offering something to the people that somewhat looked like science fiction, but undermined the rules and principles of this rule and principle-driven genre with some happy naivete. Adorno certainly has to say something about that. Condense it into just a formula is what I do when I say Star Wars gives images instead of reasons, or more carefully and more accurately perhaps, Star Wars offers only images and ever more of them, where science fiction had also given reasons for those images and created its images according to, or at least a great deal of, reasoning. Thus, while it constitutes something new, something that was hitherto unseen, Star Wars at the same time marks a relapse as regards the standards of an art form that in its fiction had embraced science. So the relapse, in short, consists in retracting the speculative space of reasons, if you will, that had been introduced to fiction and replacing it again with the space of images and ever more images. I have claimed that the mythical consciousness has entered its aesthetic stage, and specifically that of pop, in phenomena like Star Wars. But on top of that, it is specifically Star Wars that shows how an art form, which had already reached the stage of a, science-like cognition, can slip over or slip back into the mythical again. And this is, again, the story or the argument of Horkheimer Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, now applied to the development of SFF, that is science fiction and fantasy. And Star Wars also highlights how the confrontation of myth and science, emphasized in Castiera's comparative elucidation of these two forms, now takes place within the mode of art. In Star Wars, the orientation towards images, notably including music, has the double function of contemplation or entertainment and of occupying the place where reasons should be given in science fictional contexts. And so images, in other words, are not just something different than the give and take of reasons, but Star Wars, due to its direct reference to science fiction, makes them also the determinate negation of giving reasons within the aesthetic speculation about possibilities. Okay, Star Wars obviously creates its own constraints concerning plausibility and whatnot, but it is not designed to really answer questions about how things work there, which is essential for especially new wave science fiction, the art form that was crushed by the appearance of Star Wars. It is certainly true, however, that these images reduce the complexity of discursive thought. That's always the first thing that is mentioned in this discussion. But we have to acknowledge that at the same time, this continuous production of images increases the complexity of the imagery itself. And so, in fact, it is exactly by way of the complication and thickening of the network of images, hence the creation of internal constraints that must be obeyed, and also the possibility to hide numerous Easter eggs for the fans then to find. So it is this thickening of the network of images that suspends the demand for discursive explanations. And this double character of images as mythical and aesthetic is not only characteristic to Star Wars, but indeed an essential trait of the art of film, whose affinity to myth has been discussed ever since early film theory, so Benjamin Krakauer and so on. And this confirms that Star Wars and this specific, housing or accommodation of the mythical consciousness in post-20th century pop culture could have emerged only in cinematic film before then expanding its output channels. Okay. Yeah, let me repeat that the case of Star Wars is exemplary for aesthetic transformation of mythical consciousness, which means that it has to be, in further studies, has to be supported, that is complemented and contrasted with other such exemplary cases. For now, let me conclude with just some remarks on the general technique of transforming the mythical modality in Star Wars. So the question whether we believe all this, wait, do we believe this, as a character asks in the final installment of Star Wars Saga, as far as the audience is concerned, is always already answered as no, we do not believe this. We do not believe in the Force and the existence of Wookiees and so on. But we as a willing audience are, we happily let ourselves be immersed into this fantastic world of Star Wars for the pleasure of it. So we subject ourselves to that which since Coleridge is called the suspension of disbelief. And this suspension must be produced on the side of the aesthetic objects as an invitation, or let me say a persuasion. It must make the audience forget about their disbelief. It must facilitate brackets for realism through convincing world building. Furthermore, the illusionist technology of film production has reached ever new heights in providing audiovisual representations that really facilitate persuasive means of suspending disbelief, which artificially reestablishes one of these core aspects of the mythical consciousness, namely the indifference of image and thing, but now as creative acts. So the Hölderlin impulse, if you will. In the dictionary of Husserlian phenomenology, the suspension of disbelief is a specific kind of epoche. But unlike the global epoche, which reduces experience to the pure ego or pure consciousness, the suspension of disbelief is a regional epoche, a bracketing of certain aspects of the life world and our beliefs about it. It aims not at essences, but at supra-realistic possibilities, things that can be imagined more or less consistently and treated as if they were real without positing the literal reality. In short, the point is to deliberately forget everything that would otherwise render unreal and even impossible the things that are now taken for real, accentuated as subjunctively real. The imagery of Star Wars specifically, just shrugs off the disbelief through this reassuring self-irony and the cross-referential nods. But the more important philosophical point is that the function of the epoche in Star Wars consists not only in immersing the audience into unrealized and unrealizable possibilities of the imagination, but it goes that step further as it concerns the modality of mythical consciousness in its entirety. Because the official modern disbelief in the mythical consciousness as such, in its products, in its legitimacy, in its truth, this disbelief is suspended. Star Wars exemplarily offers the aesthetic, or if you will, aestheticizing brackets between which the mythical consciousness is properly accommodated and made socially acceptable, which is, not just a side effect, in what is called modern civilization, where otherwise it is either concealed and suppressed or instrumentalized. So with Star Wars, we no longer have to be surprised about any return of the mythical, like Cassira was, because here, between those accommodating brackets, mythical consciousness can play out. It can thus perform its functional autonomy. Okay, I am almost done. I just wanted to end on a more, say, on the slightly methodological or rather normative note that I think it's really time to drop certain prejudices on the side of philosophers as regards the study of these phenomena, because we do not want to fall into the same trap as Cassirer. We should stop this othering attitude that governs the philosophical literature about mythical consciousness to this day, and we should really stop equating ideology and mythology. I guess that you are not the persons I should tell this, or that you are already aware because you work on the philosophy of mythology. But this is, as you can see, a great problem that confuses the discussion. Star Wars, for instance, is really full of stupidity. And it is also full of delusions and ideological elements. But I think Star Wars should be criticized for its stupidity and for its delusional characters, for its misogyny, for instance. But like everything else in pop culture, it is a battlefield of ideological positions and not a monolith. So if we keep equating the ideological with the mythical, what we lose, or what we diminish at least, is the one thing that we should do, namely use those remaining chances that we have at enlightenment. And I wanted to end on the word enlightenment. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Stefan. That was really exciting, interesting. I'm always excited to hear a talk on Cassirer and to get a lot of the good details presented and a creative application of the ideas. So, thanks a lot. I have a whole list of questions myself, but I'll put them on hold and let others ask questions first. Okay, Marta-Jean, you go ahead and have the floor for the first question. And then Jesper, after Marta-Jean, you can go ahead and go first.
That's me?
Yeah, that's you.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't sure what name I heard.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very rich, very interesting. I'll be in Amsterdam the coming 2 years. I hope I'll have a lot of time then to talk more clearly about all of these things. Spirited defense of the value of Star Wars as an object of philosophical scrutiny. I miss one thing from your analysis, that you accuse Cassirer of forgetting about, and then refuses to come back up in your story. And that, of course, is the big dirty C word, capitalism. In talking about the status of Star Wars as a new mythology, a particular aesthetic formation of mythological consciousness, proliferation of images, I nowhere see you point out that something like Star Wars and the wave of blockbusters that came with it, Jaws, E.T., is explicitly designed to reinvigorate cinema as a big capitalist enterprise that people couldn't just stay at home and watch on television, but had to go to the cinema for, but more importantly was from the get-go conceived as tied in with an endless amount of junk that you can go out and buy and show to your friends on the playground and have all around. So if we distinguish this for a second from, say, Wagner's Ring, which would be more for the highbrow taste, perhaps, but structurally, in some ways, analogous to what you have given us in your analysis of Star Wars. We are here in a very different socioeconomic and cultural framework as a result of that. To what extent do you think that that impacts your analysis?
Yeah, greatly. It impacts my analysis greatly. Thank you very much for in a way, giving me the opportunity to address the point, which, as you observed correctly, I did not mention in the talk. And I only left the word, the complaint about capitalism in there to have at least mentioned it. I have cut about 15 pages of my talk to squeeze it into the time frame. And as I said in the beginning, Cassirer is one of the two philosophical points of departure for my project. The other is Adorno. And with Adorno, you not only have the analysis of the culture industry, which is just the name for, what you described, the junk you buy and the reinvigoration of a capitalist enterprise in artistic configurations and so on. But you also have, by the way, an analysis of Wagner as mythology, and here's also a connection to be drawn between John Williams' style of composing as based on the leitmotif thing and Wagner. So there's a lot of connections that come up. But your overall question concerns what does it mean that this transformation of mythical consciousness is not just aesthetic, but also capitalist, right? So what does it mean for the setting? Yeah, and I believe that, you know, so my plea is that we cannot ignore the kind of characteristics of our situation, and our situation is that. Cassiras' situation was it too, but he did not reflect that. And therefore, of course, the question is, how does mythical consciousness find its new modes in a capitalist society, and what does that mean? And therefore, Star Wars can and must be analyzed also in terms of how it is, you know, a franchise of Disney and an invitation to buy a lot of junk and so on and so forth. However, I think it is important to also draw the distinction between the critique of capitalism on that level and to do an inquiry into how the inner logic of this transformed mythical consciousness works. Not because these were like, not because we could separate these, but because I think we have to distinguish them for the sake of getting a clear image of how the inner logic of this transformation of mythical consciousness works. Then, of course, another analysis could bring in back the more Marxian critique or neo-Marxian critique of capitalism in this respect. But also here, we should keep in mind what Marx said about the future society, that it grows in the old. And that is something that I think is very important for critical philosophical studies of such trashy phenomena like this, that this is exactly the playground where all the delusion is happening, but also where the possibilities and the broadening of possibilities can and must be found and identified. So I'm taking a more Adornian position now at the moment, but I hope this kind of at least generally responds to your concern.
Great. Okay, Jesper, you're up.
Thank you very much for your talk, and it's really great. We had experienced a shift in temporalities, right? Yesterday it was about the past and the future, and now we're in the present. And I welcome this shift, although it is also a bit worrying, I think. And first, the worry, and this would lead me to a question. Your emphasis or the emphasis on, and the worry is about your emphasis on, as I heard it, the ability of our consciousness, or the ability of us to choose our world. You spoke about let us emerge ourselves, like the Husserlian epoche, right? You could choose to put brackets about our disbeliefs and just emergence ourselves. And I of course know this these wishes to bring back mythologies back to life, right? We have it with Latour's Gaia mythology. I mentioned it yesterday. We have it in Timothy Morton's. He speaks of Star Wars as if Star Wars were our anthology, in kind of shamanistic terms. But the thing is, Star Wars is a fiction. And I think in your conception of myth, you said myths are, and if I understood it correct, myths are fictions. They're products of imaginations. So, and my worry is then, would this not mean that we can use them, is this kind of myth we can use or utilize them for different purposes? I mean, with climate or political, just like the Enlightenment with Lessing, she said, okay, we could utilize Christianity as a form of myth, because it's just imaginative to push towards reason. But, and this leads me to my question, does this capture what the modality of myth, we discussed it yesterday, this actuality, form of actuality, Wirklichkeitscharachter of the myth, the forcefulness with which they press themselves upon us. And I think a negligence of this aspect allows us to utilize myth. So my question would then go in the direction of, what exactly do you mean with myths? I have a lot of examples of this what this enlightenment function of myth, understanding of myth, could lead to, and we have a lot of examples. I think Heidegger too is such a case. He utilizes death, right, in Sign und Zeit, says, okay, we can actually tap into the forces or the energy of death in order to choose a future, and then comes suddenly from the sky the term Volk and so on. Or you could of course also use it for good purposes. So is this description I gave of your mythology, your doctrine or understanding of mythology correct? So are we today witnessing some form of return of Enlightenment thinking of mythology with a rather radical belief in our ability of consciously choosing our futures? Or has maybe our intuitive understanding of myth changed? Or do you see a change in what we believe myth to be around 1900? I think we see this myth and ideology and so on and so forth.
Okay, that's a lot. A lot of questions, I think, in that one. I think I would try to address the problem of escapism, which I hear in your question about choosing our world. I would try to refer to what you say about the purposes or the utilization of myth, and what I think myth actually is, or mythology. And I will start with the latter point, because see, the position that I'm taking philosophically with Cassirer entails that it implies that I avoid taking a position on defining what myth as myths, as specific myths, or mythology is. I take the position, I call it the phenomenological position, of inquiring into the structures of mythical consciousness, the structures and the way they transform. That's the first thing. So this is the perspective. As I said in the beginning, I don't think that what I do is philosophy of mythology, because I am not engaging with mythology in the way that one would do that, say, based on Schelling or so, or in terms of the new mythology discussion. However, of course, I'm concerned about how myths are being utilized, how myths are being, Heidegger, yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem, that's just a case that philosophers find very distressing. If we look at the myths that are out there at this moment, and which are really dangerous, of course, this is something that should concern us. But I believe that the philosophical analysis, as philosophical analysis, and not so much then as the political engagement which I support, and emancipatory purposes to come up with new myths or whatever, that the philosophical analysis in the first instance should look into the way how it is functioning, how it works. What are the conceptual constituents then of a consciousness in the specific modality of the mythical modality, which then produces myths, and which then in the next step must look how are these myths utilized or used. Because myths are not all utilized in the same way. And there is no such distinction between the good old myths and they are fine, and now they are being instrumentalized. This is something that Cassirer could never really come up with. He could never really come up with a decisive solution, whether myth is okay and just instrumentalized, or whether myth itself has a demonic quality. And I think that before getting lost in this and leaving this to the dear colleagues from political philosophy and political theory, it would be a good task, an assignment for a more cultural phenomenological kind of philosophy to first get at these structures of the consciousness. And because these purposes change, they are part of the transformation. Yeah, and I want to rather have contribute to a vocabulary that allows to describe these, and then of course make normative judgments too, than to start with these normative worries. But because there is a division of labor, because I trust also certain colleagues and allies who do so. That's the one thing. just briefly on what you said about the ability to choose our world, I wouldn't go that far, and I don't quite believe this idea. So I introduced the epoche. Maybe I should have given more context to that, but then again, time, the epoche, because this shows how you allow yourself to be immersed, how you do this for the time being, and how you, especially in this aesthetic attitude, you never really forget where the distinction between the so-called real world and the fictional world lies. So Alfred Schütz is a great example, all the pragmatists, of describing how that works. The reality is accentuated differently in letting yourself immerse into a fictional world, but you do not exactly choose to live in that world. You know that you don't, and this is the reason why it is pleasurable. This is why aesthetic theory takes so much, makes so much efforts to describe it. See what I mean? So I don't think this is just, there is always a danger of escapism being delusional and that, but I think that there is also, these brackets are also a kind of relief and promise. And I would, for the time being, at least, defend the position that it allows myth to do something, or the mythical consciousness to perform in a way that is really, that suits it. And that has if I now may make my normative judgment, has a positive function for, social life and stuff. I'm not quite sure. Maybe I talked about something that you did not really ask about.
Jesper.
Can I just comment?
Yeah, of course, of course.
Thank you very much. That cleared things for me. My thought was that I'm not sure that you're dealing with what we normally would call myths. Then you're dealing with products of fiction and so on. I think it's the right way that you can make this epoche and you can go into this world, and it's important to describe it in a kind of or at least attempt a non-normative descriptions of these worlds in order even to understand what's going on here. I agree with you completely with that, and I don't think that it necessarily ends up in worse or better ways. I think it's important as a descriptive field. But Schelling has a lot of arguments against understanding myths exactly in this fictitious way. He says they misses the mythological consciousness. And the question is then, can we even deal with myths then in Schelling's version? Yeah. Because myths are always problematic. They're always something that has disappeared, abhanden gekommen, something of the distant past. That for me, maybe it's a bit, no, I don't know, but myths appear to be unproblematic as an object of study in the Enlightenment, and maybe also, and this is my question, maybe also for Cassirer, maybe even for Husserl and the life world and so on. Where and this is just an interesting question. This is different ways of looking at myths. So
myth is not unproblematic at all. Of course not. I mean, the story of the argument of the dialectic of enlightenment, which I invoked, speaks to that and only that. Of course. So this is not the point, but it's just, the standpoint is different at this moment. You will have noticed that I do not quite share the Schelling position. And if I may clarify this one thing, so mythology, in my view, and for Cassirer, by the way, mythology means then the cultural stock of myths. These inform fictional products like Star Wars. However, I do not see why one should then say, okay, then Star Wars is the new mythology. I would rather say it is art or pop culture, whatever, in terms of its objective configurations. However, it is precisely those configurations which give a new mode, a new medium, a new stage to the mythical consciousness, which is still related to myths in the traditional sense, like the cultural stock of myths that are traditionally handed down and which we have to do something with or not, to end with them or cannot end with them, as Bloomberg has it. But this is for me at the moment. No, it's not less important, but it's something that I would then leave to those who are interested in deciphering the mythology that informs certain cultural products, whereas I'm interested in the activity, in the function of mythical consciousness as one of those basic modes of the human mind. And I think the way that I do it is more promising for reaching for getting at new results, as it were. Thank you so much for this question.
Can I just
yes, please.
Questions? Actually, my question is similar to Jasper's. Probably, I think your concern is not about the nature of it, but exactly. I mean, I have similar questions about does Cassirer read the religious myth as we read Star Wars? I mean, it seems to be quite different, right? I mean, since for us, I mean, I can watch Star Wars feel quite easily because I know it's a fiction. I mean, it's for entertainment. All those mythical elements are just for our entertainment, you know. But if for Cassirer, I mean, he seems does not see those mythical element in the religious myth as entertainment, right? I mean, so if you ask me to just watch Star Wars for entertainment, I can just forget myself. I mean, to get into cinema is okay for 3 hours, but if you ask me to believe in Star Wars, then it's another problem, right? So I think that's probably this is not your concern, but I think this is probably one of the important questions. I mean, how do I read those myths? I mean, should I read those religious myths as just Star Wars, something like that? I mean, it seems to be not, at least it seems to be not Cassirer's position. I mean, so how? Yeah, I would just ask this question a bit about this. I mean,
nobody would ask you to watch Star Wars as actual myth, in the sense that something that might really, haunt you. Even though it is amazing to see how much people care about Star Wars beyond those 2 or 3 hours. So the cultural impact of Star Wars goes far beyond the very moment of enjoying a movie or something. It is something that keeps people busy in their lives. It does constitute a form of life, which is not a compartment, which is not, total in the sense that all aspects of their life are organized according to that, but exactly as Cassirer describes these modalities, which each have a certain, outlook on life. So a phenomenon like Star Wars imprints lives, if you will. So there is more to that than just enjoying it for a couple of hours, it seems. However, your point is absolutely right. Of course, you don't believe that stuff, and nobody wants you to believe that. But my point, again, is not whether or not these are myths that Star Wars tells, that we believe or not, but what Star Wars does to the mythical consciousness and its place, its function within culture today. And my overall claim is then that it is the disbelief, not in this or that, but the disbelief in mythical consciousness as such, the disbelief, the official disbelief in the legitimacy of mythical consciousness in what we call modern society, that is being suspended here. And that is the function of such cases like Star Wars. And that is obviously on a different level than, I mean, not higher or lower, but just a different kind of consideration than that, whether anyone needs, which is surely the case, by the way, anyone needs the wisdom of Yoda to become a better manager. This shit is out there, but this is exactly not the point. But now that I talk about it, I realize that there are people who believe that, and we should also take that into account.
Excellent. So I hope it's okay if I take an opportunity to ask a question. So we'll go about 10 extra minutes for the conversation if it sustains us, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. So I have about maybe 3 questions, but I'll start first with the question about magic. In particular, this is, I think, an important theme in Cassire's philosophy of myth, and it builds on, or one could say, I think Cassire accounts for magical consciousness, by appeal to this law of mythical consciousness, of this concreteness of the members of the relation. So we have these examples of magic, like Isis discovers Ra's name, or gets Ra to reveal his name to her. And then this is of course Egyptian story, that she then can manipulate and dominate him by the use of his name, right? So we have all these examples in mythological culture of name magic, of image magic, of whole part magic, getting somebody's spit and then using the spit and drying it in a chimney to weaken the energy of your enemies, you know? And all of that is built on this identity of sign and signified. The identity of sign and signified is what makes it possible for someone to believe magic. That manipulate the sign, I can manipulate the thing. So what I'm also interested in is, to what extent can we see magic and kind of magical practice in Star Wars? So I was just, maybe if you could explicitly kind of address the use of magic or place of magic, and to what extent do you see it there? Because it really does, in a certain way, it's exactly what is accounted for by appeal to this special modality. So this is just my general, just to extend and to think about your analysis further. I think a lot of it's implied already in what you said, but I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. The second question is about the modal function of myth in Cassire. So Cassire does seem to think that myth somehow, through its development, gives rise to religion. And then there's all these various forms that develop. But he does seem to think that even if, say, in the 21st century, none of us here believe in magic. One of the questions that comes up when you have Cassire's philosophy symbolic forms before you is, what happens to the expressive function, the Ausdrucksfunktion? You know, we have the different functions, right? Myth is made possible by the Ausdrucksfunktion, by the function of expression. But Cassire says, even if we don't have belief in magic, we do have belief in other minds. We experience other minds. So I think this is the third volume, where he says the expressive function is still active in our experience of other people, which he says you can never account for rationally, metaphysically, philosophically. It's just a mystery that there are other minds and that we encounter one another. And I wonder if this itself doesn't actually provide you with a kind of this aspect of life world that always makes possible the return of myth. I just put it as a question that I've been thinking about myself. And also whether there's a way in which the expressive function in myth lives on, even if aspects of myth don't, like belief in magic. Okay, so I know that's a big question, but I'm wondering to what extent how you build this expression or this realization of the expressive function into your own thinking. Maybe I'll just stop there. I have another question, but I'll leave it for another time. So thanks a lot.
Oh, thanks so much. Yes, I mean, first of all, the idea of a phenomenology of the everyday, where mythical and magical aspects play a role exactly in the expressive functions, that is, of course, super important to explore when thinking about the transformations of mythical consciousness. However, this, of course, I cannot do in the framework of the aesthetic transformations in the configurations of Star Wars and other art forms. But obviously, this would be not just complementary, but necessary to do than elsewhere, because it's exactly as you say, this expressive function, which is this miracle that we do understand that, and we refer to that as a magical relation or something. You know, people like the vocabulary of enchantment here because it really corresponds with the quality of the experience that you have in this moment. And the aspects of that are always, as I like to say in this metaphorical use of brackets of the epoche are bracketed because we know, okay, we have to explain this otherwise, because this is not how it works. We don't believe that it works like this, but we experience it like that, and sometimes we get the shivers or we enjoy it for what it is. This is really something to be explored beyond the scope of the second volume, and really with the third, and then with some actual phenomenologists like Schütz, like maybe Merleau-Ponty, and so on. So it's an important follow-up, if you will. Magic. Magic and Star Wars, the role of magic. For Cassirer, as you rightly say, magic is one of the core, say, stages of the mythical consciousness altogether. And just like in Horkheimer Adorno, it is something like the basic stage. This is where this begins. Before that is maybe ritual, and beyond that is somewhere totemism, but the order is not clear. And I think that's also a strength, that he does refrain from all these positivistic stages, that he does not go, Comtean in this sense. And I would have liked also to show kind of a, typology, if you will, of the magical, the ritualistic, and the totemistic phases. Now, magic is most important, and animism would be that which maybe mediates, maybe even all of them. But magic is important because there you have the will to directly act on the world. And to jump to Star Wars, then of course this happens in the Jedi and the Sith are the magicians. They are complete sorcerers. Others also live in the Force, like the Mandalorians and whatnot, or the Tuscans, but that they don't have these magical techniques. This is really exclusive then to the initiated, to those who really have some access to the Force, which is maybe mystical or maybe less than mystical. They can do this, and then something appears in their hand. They can force choke. They can become force ghosts. This is all magical thought, and I think the function of these images is that these magical motives clearly depict how something like the simplified mana of the Force works, not works as in its principles, because these remain completely concealed and just they don't occur, but how it looks like. With magic, you can show images. You can do that with ritual, but it's, that's too artsy. With magic, you can really produce some cool images also, and that's of course important, and it is. And it is this wonderful shortcut that wonderful. I mean, I'm also critical about that, but this shortcut that you can take in depicting certain things that concern these expressive functions, but then without any, completely unrestrained. Yeah. Just let them crush a massive battle robot with their hands not even touching them, and let us enjoy that. Let's also fetishize the violence here.
Yeah.
Okay,
this is very helpful, because one doesn't need to give a why when the mythical structure itself engenders a magical relation. And so this mythical space fiction is also magical space fiction. I think
that's true.
That's magical space fiction. And so it also really jives very well with your whole account of that this is not science fiction. This is mythical space fiction, magical space fiction. And it's also just to kind of further confirm your point here, is that the magicians aren't everybody. It's not just anybody. This is something that Marcel Mauss also points out, is that magic is, it's specialized. You have to get initiated and educated in this special group, and so the why is hidden from the ordinary person, and so that's also built in, is that it's secretive.
Yes.
So this is, again, one could continue to elaborate. So, it's this, once we kind of qualify that what's going on here is aesthetic transformation and not just repetition of mythology as belief in gods or whatever, then I think it's very plausible and quite illuminating, actually, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that was just a comment. Yeah. Any final words? Because it's 5:40. We should probably take a 5-minute break before we go.
All right. No, I just want to say there is, despite the conceptual differences between all those things, which are not always clear in Cassira too, I think the nice thing about the example, the magic would have been part of the 12 cut pages or 15
Sure.
cut pages. This relation between that you can find this form in which you can show magic and ritual and totemism and a lot of other, and alchemy and a lot of stupid stuff too, and that you have this playground. Star Wars really just a playground. This is really what the samurai and the sorcerer, and there comes a knight and the princess and also a droid, that all lump together, and then you have the possibility in such a world to go in any of these directions.
Yeah.
This is then the aesthetic freedom within the bounds of the mythical.
All right, thanks a lot for the talk again, and thanks everybody for the discussion. I pushed us beyond the time, so my apologies. Okay, so let's come back at 5:45 for the next talk. Okay, so I'll see you all in a few minutes.
Hi, Gregory, can I share my PowerPoint?
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the second talk for today. So let me briefly introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Professor Andrew Wan Hung, who is at the College of Professional and Continuing Education at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, so here in Hong Kong. His interests include moral and political philosophy, media and cultural studies, theories of the self, and issues in Hong Kong society. And his talk today is entitled Cassirer and Taylor on Language and Myth. So floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Actually, can you hear me? Okay. Actually, my expertise is on Charles Taylor. This time is I just read Cassirer's her writings just for this presentation and prepare this paper. So my paper will compare Cassirer and Taylor on myth and his philosophy of language. I will read the PowerPoint. Most of the content of my paper is in the PowerPoint, so that not all, since my paper got 8,000 words, so cannot cover all the elements. But I will cover most important parts of the paper. Max Muller, a leading theorist of myth in Ernst Cassirer's days, argues that myth is a kind of a diseased language, illusion and self-deception. However, Cassirer criticizes Muller and argues that such an understanding is based on naive realism and understanding of arts as imitation. For Cassirer, both myth and language were twin brothers that express the primitive human mind and activities based on the early experience of human social nature. It is inappropriate to consider myth as simply a kind of mental illness. Although Charles Taylor has not written much about myth, his criticism of designative theory of language and his analysis of language and myth with socially constitutive functions can shed light on understanding the nature of myth and its social roots. So this paper will compare both of their philosophy of language and myth. According to Cassirer, we are animal symbolicum. We try to understand the world through symbolic making. Language and myth are symbolic forms that are understood as forces, each of which produce and possess a world of its own, rather than reproducing the given reality. In contrast to other symbolic forms, such as art or science, which form only a particular part of the culture, myth is all-encompassing in representing the whole culture. Cassirer argues that it is in the intuitive, creative form of myth, not in the discursive theoretical concepts, that one may find the secret of the original conceptions of language. To understand myth, we must take the qualities of physical experience, which are emotions of primitive men, on their immediate qualitativeness. We must respect the autonomy of myth and seek to establish myth as an independent, self-contained world. Cassirer rejects reductionism. He rather chooses the approach of critical analysis of myth. It starts from the given, the empirical fact of cultural consciousness, and then goes back and inquiries about the condition of its possibilities. It seeks to reveal a certain hierarchical structure of myth and the interrelationship of its formative factors. Cassirer calls it a critical phenomenology of the mythical consciousness, which seeks to apprehend the subject of the cultural process, the human spirit, solely in its pure actuality and diverse configurations, whose immanent norms it will strive to ascertain. With such an approach, the truth of myth must be determined functionally, that is, to examine the form of objectification that it engenders. It's objective insofar as it is recognized as one of the determining factors by which consciousness frees itself from passive captivity in sensory impression and creates a world of its own in accordance with spiritual principle. Cassirer refers to Usner's philological methodology and argues that it can help us to understand and to feel the past. Then gradually, sympathetic strengths may be set in motion within us so that we find in our own consciousness that threads that link ancient and modern times. Similar to Cassirer, Taylor argues that we are language animals because we are characterized by the creation of music, art, dance, by the whole range of symbolic forms. To use Cassirer's phrase, it is through language that we formulate something that brings it into a more complete and clear consciousness. Unlike other animals, human beings possess a kind of a linguistic awareness which is different from the response triggering mode. We not only know how to respond to the signal instrumentally, but we also know how to properly apply the linguistic description. It involves sensitivity to inner rightness, a sense of expressive resonance, which allows us to align language signs with reality according to their characteristics. And this rightness can be articulated for Taylor. According to Taylor, there's two traditions of language theory. The first is designative instrumental view. Another is constitutive expressive view. The designative view is the rise of the designative view is due to the very success of natural science. So many rational empiricists consider language as an instrument for describing the world and encoding information by which we can control things. So the main concern of designative view is whether the word can denote the reality. However, this view was criticized by Frege that the meaning of a word cannot be understood independently from the context of its sentence. And Taylor also criticized the designative view for inappropriately assuming that language is just a tool to express pre-existing contents in coining a new term. The fact is that when we coin a new term, it's based on a certain background understanding that is itself constituted by language. Moreover, the designative view neglects that by using language, we are inducted into communion with others, which has metabiological meanings. And the articulation of metabiological meanings takes us beyond the words to the whole sphere of the expressive entity. Taylor rather supports the constitutive view of language, which stresses the creative role of language. It considers language as constitutive to our thinking, feelings, embedded in our everyday life. And sometimes the change of description may reshape our experience. Thus, it emphasizes the expressive nature of language that articulates the world around us and that defines meanings. Expression means to make something manifest in embodying it. This also points out the dialogical nature of language, which emphasizes the primary function of language exchange and dialogue rather than designation. Taylor admits that language has a designative function, but the designation is not the primary locus of language. Rather, it's developed based on the constitutive nature of language. Cassiner agrees with Taylor that language has a productive and constructive rather than a merely reproductive function. For Cassiner, the genesis of language cannot begin with logical theoretical cognition, which considers concepts as representing essential properties of objects. Logical theoretical cognition requires one's capability to differentiate between objects, and Cassiner questions how can such differentiate exist prior to language. Cassiner rather argues that we indeed realize and differentiate objects by means of language. He agrees with Taylor that the expressive function of language is the most primitive type of meaning underlying mythical consciousness. The mythical world is a dramatic world which is always impregnated with emotions and physiognomic characters. And then we discussed about Taylor and Cassiner on myth and metaphor. Through the study of myth, Cassiner argues that activities of myth and language are modes of teleological striving. The expression of myth is a kind of concentration of our experiences aroused by impulse, distilling those experiences into one point direct, not by content, but by the subject interest and aims. Only what appears important for our hope and anxiety is noticed and receives a name, a special linguistic asset, and human beings can solidify these impressions through symbols. Primitive language provides many examples showing that the order of naming does not depend on the external similarity between things or events. Rather, different items can have the same name and are grouped into the same concept as long as they have the same functional meaning. The phenomenon under consideration is not the actual content of myth, but the meaning and the forces it exerts on consciousness, the intensity with which it is experienced, with which it is believed. Thus, myth is an expression of the feeling of life, and that's why myth is so powerful. We are in awe of myth because it is derived from the intensity of its influence on consciousness. Myth shows us the outlines of the world by condensing our experience into a lasting configuration. We can grasp the meaning of this world only if behind it we can feel the dynamic of the feeling of life from which it originally grew. According to Cassiner, both myth and language operate alongside with metaphorical thinking. Metaphorical thinking was the most primitive way of human thought and expression. Through metaphorical expression, the conceptual process takes place, which is a transition from one to the other, by which one semantically represents the other. A myth for Cassiner is a kind of a radical metaphor, which is not simply a transaction, but a creation of the categorical itself. As Cassiner states, just as the simplest mythical form can arise only by virtue of a transformation which removes a certain impression from the realm of the ordinary, the everyday and profane, and lift it to the level of the holy, the sphere of mythical religious significance. However, because of the influence of designative theory, myth, symbols, and metaphors are in question among contemporary analytical philosophers. Taylor rejects designative theory and argues that figurative language, such as metaphors and symbols, can extend our linguistic capacity. According to Taylor, metaphors disclose certain target domains in the bivocal figuring of A through B, which is hard to literally describe. These metaphors are not arbitrarily given. They involve metabiological meanings, which are rooted in the ability of our bodily know-how to enable us to recognize the phenomenon world and understand the complicated dimension of experience. Thus, metaphors present the phenomenon accurately and articulate the phenomenon in a new way. Symbols can reveal things that are usually inaccessible to ordinary language. This is similar to a work of art that conveys the feeling of things in a way that cannot be reduced to a literal description. Taylor distinguishes metabiological meanings or human meanings from life meanings, which are simply related to our biological nature. Metabiological meaning is concerned about metabiological human needs, such as the meaning of life, traits, values, and relations that cannot be understood without self-understanding. Unlike self-standing objects in scientific study, metabiological meanings are related to our strong evaluation or ethical judgment in ethics or aesthetics. It depends on our mode of linguistic expression. It means that we cannot grasp these meanings from a dispassionate stance without experiencing our emotions. For Taylor, feelings and meanings are mostly intertwined. Most feelings such as sadness, anger, and gratitude are the response to the intentional object, which is the state of affairs that has significance for us. Our moral intuitions are always felt intuitions. Thus, it's impossible to grasp values without felt intuitions, and we have to grasp these values and meanings underlying their feelings through articulations and coining a new term. However, Taylor holds a position of moral realism and argues that moral truthfulness is independent of our experience because our felt intuitions may be wrong. Our articulation may also be inaccurate and need to be revised. And that's why we need to maintain a dialogue to articulate the world around us. We can see how Taylor's elaboration of figurative language can enrich and be supplementary to Cassiner's account of language and myth, in particular in defense of certain criticism from contemporary analytical philosophy. Both Cassiner and Taylor's account of metaphor, symbol, and myth can also demonstrate the autonomy of myth and the distinctive contribution of this figurative language to human civilization. And we'll discuss about their distinction between theoretical and mythical ideation. One of the important contributions of Cassiner's analysis is his distinction between mythical consciousness and scientific discursive theoretical consciousness. The scientific theoretical world emphasizes analysis and making distinctions. Discursive conception begins with a single perception which we expand by viewing it in more relationship. It likes to break down reality into a network of relations. The process of mythical ideation runs into the opposite direction. The intellectual process is not expansion or dissection, but compressed and distilled into a single point of meanings. And the others that lie outside these focal points of mythical conception remain invisible and wrapped in profound darkness. Cassiner calls this operation of mythical metaphor the law of the leveling and extinction of specific differences, by which every part of the whole becomes the whole itself. Instead of taking logical causal analysis of action like science, myth takes a material substantial view of the action in which the process is explained by the change of substance involving some sort of concrete original substance. And Cassirer argues that the metaphor of Asian rhetoric arises from mythical thinking by which the relationship between the part and the whole is not simply substitutions but identification. For science, change is possible only insofar as it is in accordance with universal law. No change is accidental. However, in myth, nothing is without a conscious purpose. All particular events are the direct result of other equally specific and concrete existence, or a change from one individual and concrete material form to another. Cassirer calls this process metamorphosis. By a sudden metamorphosis, everything may be turned into everything. All things are explained as caused by freedom of action. Cassirer finds that words in prayer or names of deities in different regions are conceived as having magical powers. This phenomenon of interweaving between elements of language and various forms of religious mythical concepts are not accidental. They are rooted in a common feature of the mythical language. That is a kind of apprehension that is different from theoretical thinking. For theoretical thinking, a word serves the aim of establishing the relationship between the different phenomena. The signifier and the signified are explicitly distinguished. The sign is only a representation of reality. However, such distinction between the signifier and signified is lacking in mythical thinking. Mythical intuition is always the awareness of an absolute, unique, and concrete presence and reality. Every content of consciousness to which the mind is direct is immediately translated into terms of actual presence and effectiveness. Here, thought does not confront its data in an attitude of free contemplation, seeking to understand their structure and their systematic connections, but is simply captivated by total impression. The aim of the apprehension is not to universalize the content, but to achieve its highest intensification. However, with the advancement of human mentality, the concentration and comprehension of sense experience begins to disintegrate and dissolve. This is because, apart from the power of myth-making, language by itself also has the power of logic. And in this process of evolution, words have become merely conceptual signs. At the same time, the process is paralleled by another development, that is art-like language, which was originally closely related to myth. The same mythical animation and hypostatization that gave human speech were given to every kind of artistic expression. Similar to Cassirer, based on his two theories of language, Taylor also distinguished two different kinds of semantic logic in his coining of new terms. They are designative logic and constitutive logic. Designative logic considers that a phenomenon precedes the introduction of a new term in an area of natural science. For constitutive logic, articulation or introducing a new term in the area of human meanings will reorder the phenomenon it describes. The phenomenon and the new term appear at the same time. Thus, articulation of moral intuition not only help us grasp meanings. This articulation in turn can shape our experience of these human meanings and motivate us to act accordingly. While our moral intuitions, such as pride, shame, are human universals, the situation which trigger these reactions vary from culture to culture because these human meanings, underlying feelings, are determined by other meanings that are culture specific. As Taylor states, these meanings impinge on us not singly as it will, but in interconnected schemes. In short, our feelings as experienced meanings can only come to us through expression. There are enactment and description and articulations. And the articulation of these meanings makes us experience the world differently. It may change what matters to us and how we feel with these meanings. It may also open up a new way of being in the world, which leads to the innovation of culture. Taylor further explores the constitutive power of discourse in defining footings and argues that we establish, continue, or alter footings through speech events, which finally set up a circle of communication or joint attention. By these footings, we each have certain expectations of others in which certain movies are expected and certain obligations are imposed on each other. We usually establish on or change footings by enacting them in a certain way or an alternative way. And these footings are usually generated against a broader social space created by multiplicity of already codified footings and a common understanding of social order. When many people begin to hand on these footings, they then become codified in terms of ethos, etiquettes, or laws. And new generations will then be socialized by these canonical forms, which become habitus, in turn reproducing the wider social order. Such meanings of habitus finally become doxa of society, which is our preconscious understanding of the world, a taken for granted felt reality which shapes our conscious awareness. Later, the existing norms may be changed and new public footings usually emerge in a series of rhetoric speech acts in certain social protests, which purport to establish values. Through articulation, the establishment of new terms comes along with new footings, and the alternation of establishment and ratification of meanings leads to the continuing generation of cultural differences. Taylor's analysis seems to be more concerned with the constitutive nature of language by which meaning and social relationships and therefore rituals and myths are formed. In contrast, Cassirer in his earlier writings seems to be concerned more with the theoretical and cognitive aspect of myth. However, later, the advent of Nazism inspired Cassirer to write about the political aspect of myth, which is related to the social organization of actions. And we'll talk about myth technique and rational assessment. In the technique of the modern political myths, Cassirer explores how the Nazis affirmed totalitarianism by technically using the political myth of the Aryan race. What Cassirer criticized was not the myth itself, but the political myth that was fabricated by the Nazis in their manipulation and militant use. According to Cassirer, political myths do not grow up freely. They are not wild fruits of an exuberant imagination. They are artificial things fabricated by very skillful and cunning artisans. It has been reserved for the 20th century, our own great technical age, to develop a new technique of myths. Cassirer then explores the Nazis' three steps of political manipulation by using political myths. First, while in the past, mythical language involved both semantic and magical functions. Nazis prioritized magical world over semantic world. In their political myth, they coined many new words, not for referring to new things, but to create a strong emotional atmosphere. Second, they introduced a large number of new rituals to overwhelm individuals, restraining personal responsibility and transforming private responsibility into political responsibility, and finally destroying their autonomy. Third, they established political figures that were given magical and prophetic powers and promised to offer medicines to cure all social evils. Some critics point out that Cassirer's account of modern political myth seems to fail to recognize the creative function that myths can have in sustaining a stable and enduring society. Political myths can also provide significance to the condition of an entire social group and be a means to achieve social progression. Rather, with Cassirer's analysis of the technique of myth making, a question I would like to ask is, how can we judge whether the myth received is a product of manipulation or the result of free growth reflecting certain truth or human meanings? For Cassirer, myths cannot be assessed by rational argument because their features are so emotional and passionate. Cassirer rather appeals to Spinoza's philosophy and argues that a passion can only be overcome by stronger passion. Only if we learn to develop, to cultivate, and to intensify to our active emotions can we hope to check the wild chase of our passive emotions and to remove our social and cultural life. And Cassirer suggests two passions that can be exempt from the domination of irrational emotions. They are fortitude and generosity. Fortitude is the courage to live an independent, active, and rational life with wisdom. And we must not do so simply for ourselves, but must cooperate with others to promote the common good through the passion of generosity. In contrast to Cassirer, Taylor is not so pessimistic on rational argumentation. For Taylor, myths are just one of the different ways of expression, such as traditions, psychology, evolutionary theory, religious and philosophical writings that aim to make sense of the skilled or interrelated meanings. Taylor sees these as different kinds of ideological accounts to articulate our felt intuitions. Taylor emphasized the approach of historical hermeneutical retrieval of human meanings and values, and he suggests that we can judge these different accounts of expression through an external path and internal path. The external path is to examine these different ideological accounts, or what we now call interdisciplinary studies, which can be mutually charged and may undermine our sense of the relevant strong values. The internal path is so-called reasoning through transition, or it can be called the historical comparative hermeneutical approach. Through exploring the historical transition, we come to a better account of reality because, in comparison with the previous view, we overcome some confusion or come to take a more comprehensive view on things. Taylor calls such a criteria of assessment the best account principle. In the case of myths, while we can examine myths by comparing them with other historical, philosophical, psychological, and religious accounts, we can also trace the historical development of myths, as Cassinus does, and assess which account can provide less confusing and better sense of the self and the world. Such articulation also helps us to place something out in the public space between interlocutors, and thus to bring us together participants in a common act of focus. More importantly, what is disclosed through articulation is related to characteristically human concerns, as our human relationships and emotions are also shaped by the way we articulate. Our articulation of something external in turn affects how we feel about those things. Thus, people with very different cultural vocabularies have quite different kinds of feelings, aspirations, and sensibility, experience different moral and other demands, and so on. In such articulation, we may face a conflict of interpretation. Such conflict will challenge our ordinary understanding. It also opens us to hermeneutical debates. The hermeneutical argument then is to arbitrate between different worldviews. It aims to establish not that some position is correct absolutely, but rather that some position is superior or better to some other. We are convinced that a certain view is superior because we have lived a transition which we understand as era reducing and hence as epistemic gain. I think that Taylor's hermeneutical approach is more consistent with our past experience in debates and investigation of social science, religious and philosophical studies. Cassinus' denial of a rational assessment of myth seems to be too pessimistic. In contrast, while Taylor does not reject the powerful emotional influence of myths, he emphasized that our articulation of these myths, these meanings, may make us experience the world differently and change how we feel with these meanings. Cassinus' pessimistic attitude toward political myth may be derived from his experience during the Third Reich. However, the cause of the rise of Nazism and the Second World War are multifaceted and complicated. The use of political myth by Nazis is just one of the various factors, social historical factors. Cassinus may have overestimated the role of the ideology and rhetoric in the Third Reich. Some scholars would argue that materialistic motivation seems to play a more substantial role in supporting the Nazis in Germany. In short, the experience in Nazi Germany just cannot reveal a probable rational assessment of myth, while such assessment should be a kind of hermeneutical assessment rather than scientific empirical assessment. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Welcome for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. Maybe you could, there you go. Thanks a lot. Thanks. We can see each other better. Very good. Okay, yeah, thanks for the talk. It's nice to hear more about Cassirer after we kind of just a couple talks on Cassirer one after the other here. So we have about 15 minutes for discussion. So if you have questions, go ahead and raise your virtual. Okay, Carlos, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation that I like very much. I have a question. I have lots of questions, but I have a question that for me is important. You said that for Cassirer, myth is a radical metaphor. Can you explain it better, this intuition that Cassirer have done? Because for me, a radical metaphor is a metaphor that explodes, it disappears.
To explain how radical it is, you mean?
Radical metaphor. You said.
Wait a minute. I think for Casilla, based on my understanding, maybe Gregory can or others can explain it further. I think myth is full of metaphor. I mean, they use different metaphor to something.
Yes.
Metaphor is something we know to express something we do not know and cannot express literally. I mean, you use our general understanding. So in myth, there's a lot of unnatural or supernatural mystical elements, and so I think it's in this sense that there's kind of a so-called a kind of radical metaphor. It's more than a general metaphor we use in our everyday life. It's what I understand. Is it something like this, or is there any?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, yeah, I'll just add that there is in language and myth, I think Stefan mentioned it in his talk, there's a chapter at the end called the power of metaphor. And there you have this comparison and discussion of metaphor and language, metaphor and myth. And it's you can already see this kind of identification of the non-identical that's implied by the mythological law that Stefan mentioned before.
As I thought that I'm not sure because I didn't read the text, but we can think about a radical metaphor if we think about the metaphor not just as a structure of meaning, but also with the strengths, the force, the mana that Stefan talked before. So perhaps a radical metaphor is a structure of meaning that has some strengths in it, but I'm not sure.
I think the most radical part is that it brings out something religious meaning, religious significance is quite different from the other general metaphor. So it's not simply a kind of a simplest a kind of general transformation of meaning. It brings us it use a kind of a ordinary language to lift it to the level of the sacred, to the holy sphere, to the religious meaning. I think is in this sense he says it's a kind of radical metaphor.
Okay. Yeah, there is a little passage. I just thought that I would read it from the Language and Myth. I don't know if this will help at all, but Casilla says, it is equally clear that for mythic thinking, there is much more in metaphor than a bare substitution, a mere rhetorical figure of speech, that what seems to our subsequent reflection as a sheer transcription is mythically conceived as a genuine and direct identification.
I just remember one of the explanation by Charles Taylor about the metaphor. Let's say this is a key. I mean, but we use this word the key also in other area. Something very important. We also use the key. It's a kind of metaphorical usage of the word. But in religious meaning, it's very different. Right? I mean, when let's say in the Bible, I mean, when you talk about the angels or the fire in the eyes or whatever, I mean, all these are metaphorical, but it's unlike our ordinary usage in our everyday living. I mean, it brings us certain very intense experience of certain transcendence, religious experience. I think this is what Casilla talking about those religious myths by using radical metaphors to express certain very condensed spiritual experience the people experienced before. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I thought I can just add that, I mean, Casira puts radical and radical metaphor in quotation marks. So it's inauthentic speech, if you will. He sometimes calls it fundamental. And I think in my interpretation, what he does certainly not mean is that this metaphor would go rogue or something. So there would be radical like this. It is radical as in the Latin word for root, radix. So that it is, I think that's this, otherwise it would be too, too punchy for Casilla style, I guess. it sounds more radical in English, I feel, than it did in his German. However, my question concerns, Andrew, your evaluation of Cassirer, and in the end of the evaluation of Cassirer's, let me say, standpoint that he expresses in his late The Myth of the State. I think there is really a lot of trouble in interpreting Cassirer's latest book, his last book, really, in the context of his overall philosophy of myth, because here he is clearly taking the standpoint of a political theory, which lends itself also to the projects of ideology critique that have picked it up, or I think also very productively. However, I think there is that especially this last section on the modern political myths does not speak about the philosophy of myth or mythical consciousness anymore, but is really trying to debunk a certain myth in the singular that has been, that has not just been abused or instrumentalized, but which is rotten from the core, if I may use a more radical figure of speech, the Aryan myth and so on. And you said that there is a pessimistic attitude in Cassirer towards argumentatively responding to myth. And I think this is not correct. I think that pessimism is really the one thing that does not describe Cassirer's philosophical attitude. Not talking about the person, I don't know what kind of guy he was, but his philosophical attitude is not that of pessimism in any sense that we would ascribe to philosophical pessimism. It is rather a very, very idealistic also in the normative sense. And I think he's precisely not pessimistic or skeptical about argumentative reconstruction of the inner logic of myth. What he thinks is absolutely futile is engaging with someone or some, say, worldview that uses myths as weaponized. And also with a philosophy that does not use myths to, like Plato, for instance, to as heuristical means, but as something that replaces argument. So I think Cassirer doesn't want to confuse language games, to use a different kind of vocabulary. He just doesn't want us to think that you can debunk myth with arguments that are alien to this particular myth that is designed to make the argumentative give and take of reasons go away. I think this is more the problem, but from the epistemic point of view, yes, you can bring arguments to reconstruct how this myth works and how it has been implemented and so on and so forth.
But I just think, for Cassirer, at least, he can see the political myth by Narcissus is fabricated. So obviously he can discern is true or not, is based on reality or not. I just think so obviously, obviously, once he can, but why did he say, it cannot be assessed by rational, it cannot be rationally assessed, but it's what his word is. It says that it can only be overcome by stronger passion. And that's the point I probably disagree. I think, as probably we as philosophers, we still think that rational analysis and argument can have to make distinction or to make judgment on whether the myth is true or not, based on the authentic experience or not. So what's the difference between me and you and me? You think
yeah,
it's not so pessimistic. You think my point of pessimistic is not on myth, but on rational assessment on myth. So you disagree with me on rational assessment, or what? On Cassirer's argument?
I disagree on about the conceptual levels. So there is rational argumentation about myth as a form of consciousness and so on. That's possible. That's what he does. That's the philosophical project even.
Yes, yes.
However, there is no such thing as rationally arguing with somebody who has weaponized myths in order for to change the habits of a people, as he describes that.
But I just don't agree with this too. I mean, why cannot? I mean, in the face of Nazis, I mean, obviously, people
because they kill people. I mean, I think it's the pessimism in Cassirer really concerns the pessimism is about Nazism. The pessimism is about mass murder. That this and the plane on which he tries to address it is the one plane that he knows where he can play, which is that of, then ideologies on the one hand, which he calls political myths, and myths proper on the other hand, that he finds a philosophical voice to address this at all. But the pessimism is then not so much about the structures of the kind of consciousness and the way one can argue about how they work or not, but the pessimism is about, the very concrete political situation in which actual weapons and weaponized myths are being used, and where you can read as much Goethe as you want, you will still be killed. I think that's the point, very concretely in this historical situation that he writes that.
Okay, but yeah, okay, I understand you say in that situation, I mean, people are so much manipulated by those language and emerge in such situation, so they cannot easily overcome by simply rational argument. I mean, the situation, right? But my question is whether Cassirer provide any criteria for us to assess the reality. I mean, the truthfulness of the myth. I mean, it seems not, right? I mean, in Cassirer's writing, it seems it has talked about the myth of the primitive Asian religions and the fabricated political myth, but he seems to not provide any method for us to assess how we can assess whether it's true or not. I mean, no, he didn't provide this, so I'm not sure. So that's why I'm not sure. Probably your interpretation is right, but I cannot find he has provided us a method to assessment, to do such assessment.
If I just to clarify, you're right. He hasn't. He has not.
Yeah.
His philosophy does not provide any means for that. And I think what I'm trying to say is there is also in Cassirer himself a confusion about the conceptual levels, if you will. But again, the pessimism, say if there is pessimism in Cassirer or something like resignation, maybe rather, then this concerns again not myth as a function of the human mind, because this is something you cannot
No.
But the assessment of whether this myth is convincing or true or not, or another, this is just not part of the program of a philosophy of symbolic forms. This is part of ideology critique, and Cassirer, fortunately or unfortunately, did not contribute to that. So I think this is why also those attempts at using Cassirer now, as much as I like having Cassirer in the discussions by Stanley and Jason Stanley and Chiara Buttici and many others now, I just think that they pick Cassirer from the wrong end. That he is really good in terms of enlightening us about the deep structures of that modality, but he's really, really, really bad at giving us any rules for dealing with devastating consequences of weaponized myths, ideologies, delusions, and stuff. And he just feels like he should respond to that, but then he passed away. I mean,
I agree with you. Basically, I also agree with you. He has a contribution in helping us to analyze the mythical consciousness, and to a certain extent, I think probably I'm not sure, but I think Charles Taylor has inherited certain ideas from his writing too. I mean, yeah. So absolutely. I basically agree with you on this contribution. I mean, in particular on Richard's myth. And yeah, since I cannot present the whole paper, so probably the part of appreciation or my affirmation on Cassina's part is not present in the PowerPoint.
Very interesting questions and discussion. Thanks. And any other questions? We could about 5 more minutes or so for questions and discussions. So I don't know. I may take the opportunity to ask a question myself then here. Yes, so thanks for your talk. I was wondering whether you had said something briefly in passing about how Cassirer is more concerned with the theoretical aspect of myth in the earlier work. And then you spoke about how later on he turns to focus on the political dimension. And I agree that, you know, there is this turn to look at the political myths and of course differentiate the myth according to plan, the artificial myth of National Socialism and fascism versus the kind of indigenous mythological structures that are not made according to plan. Okay, so we have that differentiation. But you know, in the earlier, you know, in the 20s, I wouldn't say I would want to qualify this claim that it's just theoretical, because one of the constant points that Cassirer does make throughout the book is that he says this a few times, that myths are a kind of retelling of ritual, or that actually he says this a few times, and it's actually one of these questions that we need to answer by looking at the ethnography. It's a question that you really can't answer without looking at the ethnography. He says that it's the ritual that then are put to narrative. And so we tell stories, but the stories are based on the ritual practices. This is something, and so Cassirer, I think, is in that way very attentive to practice and the kind of practical dimension. And he actually thinks that that's in a way at the origin of even just mythical narrative. And actually, I think this is one of the more dubious aspects, actually, and debatable issues. If you read Strauss, in my opening remarks, I was critical of Strauss, but there's a lot of great ideas there. And one of the ideas that he has is that maybe that isn't right. And that actually, if you go culture to culture, you see that actually there are a lot of stories that are told that can't be easily traced back to a particular ritual or something like this. So that's like I don't know, big question mark when I'm reading Cassirer and thinking about this. What's the relation between ritual and myth? You know. Anyway, so I just wanted to say.
Actually, you say you did read. You can where did you read this? I mean, from Cassina?
Yeah, it's in the second volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I can send you some references. Yeah.
Since in Language and Myth, I cannot see this, and indeed this point, I mean, the ritual originated from the myth is originated from rituals, is part of the Taylor's argument. He will say that our
Interesting
language and articulation, I mean, if is foreign from certain rituals practice.
So this might be another point then of connection between the two. So yeah, I can send you some of the references in the second volume.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
This is also something that Strauss problematizes. So I just leave it as an open question.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for
make a blanket statement. Yeah, of course.
Since originally I thought this is the point. Originally I thought Cassina didn't mention this. I mean, since in his Language and Myth, he seems to say that the myth is just a certain condensation of certain spiritual experience, something like this.
That's going on too, you know, but it's very complicated. Yeah, as Stefan said, there's a lot of writings. There's the Begriffsform ranking. There's so much there, so it's a lot to put together. But it's nothing your account can't handle, and in fact may actually augment it and actually improve it in various ways. So it's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can take a break, maybe 10 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll hear from Professor Correa. Okay, so I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, I think it's 6:45, so we are ready to return. And our next speaker, this is our last speaker before the dinner or lunch break, depending on where you are, is Professor Carlos João Correa. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name too bad. Okay, I didn't roll my R's, but yes.
It's very difficult to say, João.
Well, yeah, okay. Yes, so Professor Correa is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Lisbon, where he has been teaching for a long time, since 1980. I see.
Almost 40 years, yes.
Wow, before I was born. You've been teaching since before I was born, so I will be listening carefully to everything you have to say. He's interested in published and worked in philosophy of art, religion, personal identity, metaphysics, German idealism, and is also interested in classical Indian thought. His talk today is entitled Lévi-Strauss and Wagner's Mythologies. So take it away.
Hello, good morning to all. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be at Hong Kong University. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if everything is correct. No problem, you're seeing? So I'll begin. Lévi-Strauss, or Lévi-Strauss if you prefer, begins his study of Wagner's Parsifal with a surprising statement. According to the French anthropologist, we find in this Wagnerian drama the most profound definition that has ever been given of the myth. The essay in question, first published in the catalogue of the 1975 Bayreuth Festival and resumed after an extended reworking in 1983 in his book The View from Afar, begins precisely with a quote from the end of the first scene of Parsifal. In that scene, we find the dialogue between Gurmans, the veteran Grey Knight, and the young Parsifal, when the latter is introduced to Montsalvat Castle shortly after the episode in which he is morally disapproved for having slaughtered a swan. Parsifal complains that he's facing strange experience in this new world. On one hand, he can barely move, and yet he feels that he has traveled a lot. The meaning of this statement is obvious, as it translates the abrupt act of initiation, if not the maturation and growth of this young fool in the mysteries of a new world that he barely understands and whose true meaning will only be revealed much later. Regarding this immobile journey, in a somewhat paradoxical way, Gurmans answers him with a crucial statement. You see, my son, here times become space. Du siehst, mein Sohn, zum Raum wird hier die Zeit. Lévi-Strauss does not translate it literally, but immediately gives it a unique tone. Quoting, you see, my son, here space and time are confused. And then he adds these words that in the first act, Gurmans addressed to Parsifal, while the scenes change under the eyes of the spectators, undoubtedly offer the most profound definitions that has ever been given to the myth. This talk, therefore, has a double objective: to show to what extent this definition of myth captures Lévi-Strauss' anthropological reading, but on the other hand, to allow us to underline the unique and original interpretation that the French anthropologist offers us of Wagner's work. In multiple moments of his research, Lévi-Strauss was confronted with the nature interpretation of the myth. As we'll say, in fact, in the famous program Apostrophed by Bernard Pivot in 1984, the myth constitutes one of the two main themes of his anthropological inquiry, the other being the study of kinship relations. Now, it is important to recognize that both in the limitation of the concept in question, the myth, and in the clarification of its best interpretation, it is at least surprising to represent the mythical narrative as being the point of confusion between time and space. If you look at another statement by Lévi-Strauss right at the opening of his famous tetralogy, Mythologique, namely quoting, Wagner must be recognized as the irrefutable father of the structural analysis of myths, then it is easy to concede that the work of the German composer was the crucial inspiration for Lévi-Strauss' examinations of mythology. Not only does Wagner offer him the best definition of myth, but he brings forward the fundamental grounds of the structural interpretation of mythical narratives, principles that the French anthropologist will cultivate throughout his life. However, the surprise did not end here. According to Lévi-Strauss, this new model of myth is of musical nature. One might have thought that Lévi-Strauss would have just been fascinated by the German composer recreation of ancient mythology, the Nordic mythology. However, it does not seem to me to be the underlying reason for this fascination. On one hand, Wagner's work are seen as themselves interpretations and not mere variations of mythological traditions. And on the other hand, the heart of the matter is not the multiple stories narrated by Wagner, but rather the musical elaboration. As Lévi-Strauss says, quoting, it is either revealing that the structural myth analysis is done first by Wagner through music. This means that more important than the Wagnerian recreation of the ancient myths of traditional European culture, what matters is the very musical way in which they were worked. In a word, the musical repetition of myths is itself the principle of structural analysis of mythological materials. Let us see at first the way in which Lévi-Strauss thinks the anthropologist's theory and the importance he attached to the myth. Indeed, at the end of 1970's Marseille Conference, the French thinker does not hesitate to present his work in anthropology as being a composition of meanings, analogous to that which a musician performs with notes and musical phrases previously given. If we browse the tetralogy, the musical concern that motivates him appears undeniable. So beyond the opening mentioned above, we unveil a part entitled Themes and Variations, as well as Sonata for Good Manners, a brief symphony, an escape from five senses, a cantata of a sarigaya, that is an opossum, a well-tempered astronomy with a double inverted canon, followed by a toccata, a chromatic piece, and a rustic symphony based on the bird concert. The examples could be multiplied, but I think that these are too sufficient to apprehend the intuition that for Lévi-Strauss, anthropology is, in its way, a form of music composition. To understand this intuition, it is crucial to bear in mind the thinker's purpose to introduce a new type of logic that, without calling into question the fundamental principles of formal logic, can translate the exercise of human thought in the world. The fundamental interest of ethnological studies is not for Lévi-Strauss to elucidate the different ways of organizing life in a community, but rather in knowing how to surprise in these cultural forms the essential features of the operation of the human mind itself. In this way, cultural is nothing more than the shadow of the pure activity of the human spirit, just as the latter must be seen as a pure expression of symbolic activity. As the author points out at the end of Mythologique, we can discover human nature. And he says the notion of human nature, which we persist in employing, in the power of managing the empirical diversity of the world in new structures and categories, being a task of anthropology to promote the intelligible composition of the symbols present in the different cultures. Carrying out a Copernican revolution in the ethnological studies by detecting in the myths and beliefs the same structural matrix of thought, Lévi-Strauss defends the identity between cultural structures and the very activity of human mind. For the French anthropologists, the human spirit is not equivalent to the faculty of reason. Since Rousseau and David Hume, you knew this, but at no time it proves to be irrational. When the author postulates that the more meaningful dimension of meaning is a broader and more valid category than the rational human dimension, since it constitutes its founding nucleus, all antinomy regimes found on the cleavage between reason and affectivity, intellect and sensitivity dissolve radically, allowing us to understand that the manifestations of a concrete and sensitive logic are undoubtedly the most significant and pertinent. That is why, for example, at the Jealous Porter, Lévi-Strauss criticized the methodological orientation that runs through the analysis of human culture, from Vico to Freud, which privilege meaning over the significant function. For the French anthropologists, the symbolic system that is offered in cultural activity, as for example in the creation of myths and artistic activity, reflects the unconscious activity of the human mind. As we have seen, the fundamental interests of ethnological studies on cultural would not be found so much in elucidating different modes of social organization, but rather in apprehending in their cultural patterns the essential traits that constitute the activity of human spirit. Quoting, if, as we believe, the unconscious activity of spirit consists of imposing forms on content, and if these forms are essentially the same for all minds, modern and ancient, primitive and civilized, as in fact the study of symbolic function, just as the latter expressed in language in such a clear way, it is necessary and sufficient to obtain the unconscious structure underlying each institution or each customer to obtain a principle of interpretation valid for other institutions and other customers. To understand the myth for Lévi-Strauss is to decipher the invariant features of the mind that are present there, showing the ordering and logic power of the spontaneous and unconscious activity of the spirit. From this interpretation of the myth, that is, for Lévi-Strauss, story narrative structures according to the unconscious laws of human spirit, we can settle its function. Quoting, the unconscious is always empty, or more precisely, it is as foreign to image as the stomach are relating to the foods that pass through it. An organ of specific function, it limits itself to imposing structural laws to inarticulated elements that come from different planes, drives, emotions, representations, and memories. This function consists of providing a logical model for resolving a contradiction, an impossible task when the contradiction is real. But what contradiction? More than a single contradiction, we can detect, according to Lévi-Strauss, several, each associated with different paradigms of mythologies. We'll focus on two of these mythological models that are, according to the anthropologist, structurally analyzed by Wagner. One of the most important leitmotifs in Wagner tetralogy is the theme of renunciation, the Entsagung, or the Entsagungsmotiv. Indeed, the theme of renouncing love is heard clear 14 times in The Ring. And let's see if you can hear. This theme that of cutting Lévi-Strauss, this theme that of renouncing love appears for the first time in the composition of the Rheingold at the precise moment when Alberic knows for the Rhine nymphs that he can only win gold if he renounces all kinds of human love. This frightened musical motif is a warning to Alberic, given at the very moment when he says that he takes the gold and that he renounces love once and for all. All of this is obvious and simple. It is the literal meaning of the theme. Alberic is renouncing love. This resignation is followed by another one, now by Wotan, who renounces or pretends to renounce not only to Freya, a symbol of love and fertility in exchange for Valhalla, but also after Erda's intervention to the ring forged by Alberic. It is no accident that in the Siegfried, Wotan presents himself as the luminous Alberic, Licht Alberic, and Alberic himself has his dark side, Schwarz Alberic. Indeed, there are scenes in The Ring in which the issue of resignation is evident, particularly when Wotan, for different reasons and different contexts, renounces his children. He renounced first to Siegmund Sieglinde, the purest and most free of human beings, but also when he punished Brunhilde, the young warrior, the angel of death, the one that only those condemned to die can see, who not only sympathize with the tragic fate of the loving brothers, Siegmund and Sieglinde, but falls in love with their son, Siegfried, thus betraying the will of Wotan, she that in own being is just the pure expression of that will. As is known, the first two, Siegmund and Sieglinde, will be abandoned to their fate, while Brunhilde is condemned to stay asleep and enclosed in a ring of fire. Quoting, now the second moment, important and surprising, in which the theme resignation reappears in the Valkyria, is in the Valkyria, in circumstances that make it extraordinarily difficult to understand why. The moment Siegmund finds out that Sieglinde is his sister and falls in love with her, and precisely when they were going to start an incestuous relationship, thanks to the sword that is stuck in the tree, and when Siegmund tries to pull it out, at that moment, the subject of resignation to love reappears. This seems like a mystery, because at that moment, Siegmund is by no means renouncing love. He's doing exactly the opposite and getting to know love for the first time in his life with his sister, Sieglinde. How to understand this paradox? The answer is given in The Twilight of Gods, when Siegfried discovered not only what is to be in love with Brunhild, but also the cursed ring itself. Let us recall the narrative context. At the end of Siegfried, the hero breaks Wotan's holy spear, easily crossing the circle of fire surrounding Brunhild and waking up with a kiss. She finds herself now mortal, and despite the joy of love, she senses Siegfried's tragic fate. In The Twilight of God, Brunhild and Siegfried exchange symbols of love. She gives him his horse, grain, while Siegfried offers her, in his innocence, the fearsome ring. Later, through a potion, Hagen, the son of Alberic, managed through magic that Siegfried forget Brunhild and marry his sister-in-law, Gudrun. However, the betrayal sequence. Siegfried, disguised but having lost his memories, obtains Brunhild's ring through violence. Later, when Brunhild sees the ring in Siegfried's hands, she decides for fatal revenge, whose expiation will accelerate the returns of the ring to the Rhine and the very twilight of the gods. All of this is known. Now, as Lévi-Strauss points out, quoting, Siegmund will possess both power and love. Siegfried will obtain both the power of the ring and the love of Brunhild. But it is precisely the threatening return of the same musical motif that intervenes to contradict the event that it unfolds behind the apparent triumph. The musical theme, on the contrary, reveals the fatal outcome. Thus, the enigmatic meaning of the Siegmund and Sieglinde scene turn on to be logical. Even when it is believed to have both, on one hand the sword and the ring, and the other the love, they cannot be preserved at the same time, which constitutes the invariant element of this entire narrative. There is therefore a first of obvious contradictions between power and love that the myth seeks to solve. But there is a second, more subtle one, which is only visible if we articulate the three themes that are associated with the renunciation of love. Three treasures in the expressions of Lévi-Strauss, namely, first, the gold of the Rhine, second, the sword driven by Wotan in the ash tree, which in turn is the tree of life, the tree of the multiple worlds of Norse mythology, and third, Brunhild itself. So for the French anthropologists, these three myths, apparently so distinct, are at heart the same. In other words, an entity prevails over them, and they are therefore protected. Gold by the three Rhine nymphs, the sword because it was inserted by Wotan in such a way that no one could distract it, and finally Brunhild, protected by a ring of magic fire that no one can cross. These three prohibitions are created by Wotan, which gives even greater unity to the variants of the same theme. In turn, all these prohibitions are transgressed. Gold by Alberic, the sword by Siegmund, and later by Siegfried, who managed to forget it again. Brunhild by Siegfried. Thus, three central ideas can be organized: genuine value, interdiction, and transgression. The final twilight is mythological display that the contradiction is real. Everything will return to this starting point, but again under the theme of renunciation, in this case, Wotan's absolute resignation. Fricka, the mother goddess, was right in Valkyria. Fate, even if lived by the gods, is not reconcilable with the world of freedom. Thus, Lévi-Strauss concludes, human history can truly begin, taking the place of the divine saga, as it will consecrate the success of the supreme exchange of the world of necessity for that of contingency, which Wotan finally ended up resigning. Let us now observe Parsifal's main mythological contradiction and the way in which Wagner elucidated. According to the interpretation proposed by Lévi-Strauss, Wagner presents us with the conflict of the medieval myths between two opposite worlds in which mediation seems impossible. On one hand, the world of Amfortas, and sick and ailing world, in that the space of communication has become glacial and silent, creating a world over which an important monarch reigns, unable to fill his post, in which plants, animals, and people languish. In Earth's sterile world, a world of desolate land, the wasteland of Celtic mythology. And the other world, Klinkser world, is opposed to this world, a world in which relationship and communication arise without any restraint. Lévi-Strauss tells us the flower girls in the Klinkser world offer a vivid illustration of the lust that the achromatism of music express the unnatural warmth. The first mediation presented in the myth is in essence false, since it expresses the puzzle itself, the contradiction. Her name is Kundry, and he appears in the great castle as a subtle, half-savage figure, a symbol of human despair. But in Klinkser world, Kundry emerges as one of the dominant figures, seductive and sphinx par excellence. That is Kundry. Quoting Lévi-Strauss, between these two worlds in which mediation is cancelled in one by excess and by default in the other, and that Herodias' laughter at the suffering of Christ, the silence of the great visitors before Amfortas marked extremes, the problem formulated in mythological terms will be to establish a balance. To achieve it, it is necessary to undoubtedly, like Parsifal, to have gone to one and to have left it, to have been excluded from the other and to re-enter. But Lévi-Strauss goes further. It is known that the reason for the question not raised, it was the riddle of the traditional myths, was rejected by Wagner. It replaced it with another that constitutes, in a certain way, its inverse, fulfilling, however, the same function. Instead of communication being ensured or established by an operation of the intellect, it will be by effective identification. Parsifal will not understand the riddle of the Grail and will remain unable to solve it until he relieves the drama that originates it. The drama consists of a breakup, and because the hero feels it in his flesh, the breakup is no longer just between the here below and the beyond, but rather between sensitivity and intelligence, suffering humanity and other forms of life, earthly and spiritual values. Throughout Schopenhauer, says Lévi-Strauss, Wagner does meet Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the first to see in compassion and identification with others an authentic way of communication, before the emergence of social life and the articulated language, capable of uniting men with each other and with all other forms of life. The crucial point of the Wagnerian interpretation consists not so much in recognizing that one does not know, but instead that one knows what one ignores, and that it is never obtained by an intellectual act, such as the communication, but rather does Mitleid, that is through compassion, or if you prefer, an impulse of pity, élan or de pity. The last point, according to our interpretation of Lévi-Strauss anthropology, all the contradictions observed, both in The Ring and in Parsifal, as in the traditional myths of human culture, are in the limits the expression of the split between thought and life, or in other terms, between culture and nature. Whatever the relationship of the human being with life, to instrumentalize it, to contemplate it, to love it, and so on, a cut takes place, a separation between the structure of symbolic meaning of thought and life in its flow, the ring on the one hand and the Rheingold on the other, or as the symbolic dichotomy between the worlds of Amfortas and Klinkser. The function of the myth reveals itself thus as the consolation of thinking in the face of the flow and vital energy, the strength, but also the chaos of existence. It may be objected that the Wagnerian mythological universe, and a fortiori of all mythology, is in essence intrinsic to any rationality. According to Lévi-Strauss, this statement is due to prejudice. There are, in his view, two paradigms of human knowledge. The first has its roots in classical antiquity, and of Greek philosophy that established the paradigm of a non-sensitive logos. This model became dominant in Western culture after the Cartesian knowledge revolution. However, there is a second older way of knowing whose roots are lost in the past of humankind and which Lévi-Strauss designated with the name of a flower, a wild pansy, whose common name in France is La Pensée Sauvage. That's the flower, but it's also a specific type of thinking, the savage mind, the wild thought. The latter, in the author's words, the direct but oddly apprehension of the data of sensory perception. It is therefore a logic of the sensitive or of the concrete, privileging as its matter what Locke will have designated in the 17th century as secondary qualities. In fact, beyond the extension, the solidity, the volume, and the number or quantity, the so-called primary qualities, the English philosophers stressed the idea of qualities perceived directly by contact, as in the case of colors, sounds, odors between others. According to the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, it is possible to construct with the different data apprehended directly by the sensor contact a logic of thoughts as rigorous as that which will later be cultivated in the Western model of science. In this concrete logic, operations are carried out using sensory data as instruments, as tools, such as sounds, flavors, perfumes, the colors of plants, the morphology of animals, in a word, nature or else, as in the case with mythical narratives, with fictional characters. One of these privileged forms of expression is found in the aesthetic and artistic activity of humanity, namely in the cognitive forms that belong to them. Moreover, Lévi-Strauss does not hesitate to present music as the form par excellence of this same logic, maintaining that Wagner went even further, having succeeded in creating a meta-language of musical nature that is appropriated for the interpretation of mythical narratives. Quoting, this search for an intermediate path between the exercise of logical thinking and aesthetic perception should naturally be inspired by the music that has always practiced it. And it is not only in general terms that this approach is necessary. When he suggests that the analysis of myths was comparable to that of a significant score, we only took the logical consequence of Wagner's discovery that the structure of myths is revealed through the score. The idea of this perfect combination of meaning and sensitivity is transmitted to us by George Steiner, who never hid his admiration for both Wagner and Lévi-Strauss' intuition that only music holds the key to understanding the supreme mystery of man. Quoting George Steiner, only music is a universal first language, immediately understandable to everyone and untranslatable by any other language. The speech comes after the music. Even before the chaos of Babel, the speech was part of the human fall. It was no accident that the two visionary spirits most sensitive to the crisis of the classical order, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, saw in music the essential expression of energy and meaning. At the end of this talk, let us capture the psychological proximity between music and mythology. Quoting Lévi-Strauss, we believe that the real answer lies in the common character of myths and musical work, in the fact they are language that each transcend in their own way the plane of articulate language, although they require, unlike painting, a temporal dimension to manifest themselves. But this relationship with time is of a very particular nature. Everything happens as if music and mythology only need time to inflict a denial. Those are, in fact, time suppression machines. The rearing of the musical work, due to its internal organization, therefore, immobilize the time that passes. So when we listen to music, and while listening to it, we achieve a kind of immortality. We can see how the music resembles the myth that also overcomes the antinomy between historical time already given and the permanent structure. And to conclude, in the anthropologist's interpretation, Goldman's words addressed to Parsifal that here space and time are confused, gain new meaning. We are in effect facing the most profound definition of myth, since myth is nothing more than a time suppression machine, but using for this purpose, as its tool, the narrative time itself. in the end. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the very inspiring talk, very interesting and stimulating presentation. Okay, so we have 15 minutes for discussion, and then we'll take a 30-minute break. So open up the floor to questions and comments. So I'll go ahead and get started while we wait for others to come in. You can either send me your name and a message, or you can just put up the virtual hand. This is such a rich talk. There's so much for me that I want to speak to, but I'll just begin with something very general that you towards the beginning of your talk. I saw the phrase Copernican revolution. To Strauss having come a Copernican revolution, and he's seeking this significant function and looking at these cultural patterns. And I was seeing a lot of overlap with the way that I would also describe Ernst Cassirer's philosophy of culture. So I'm really interested in how you see Strauss diverging from Cassirer's philosophy of culture, because Cassirer also has this idea that we have this Copernican revolution that we're trying to apply to the case of myth as well. So I'm just curious what your general thoughts are on that.
I think the two authors, the Cassirer and Lévi-Strauss, in a way, they are very similar, because Cassirer, as I understand him, and I don't know so well as Lévi-Strauss, underlines the idea of function. The symbol activity is a function. And in the case of Lévi-Strauss, it's the same. So the symbol activity is a mental function. And when Lévi-Strauss says that, when I said that Lévi-Strauss makes a Copernican revolution, is to say that when we try to understand a myth, or when we try to understand the cultural, or when we understand the mythical, artistical activity, something linked with cultural, and also kinship and all kinds of things, they are reflections, they are shadows of the human mind. So the functions of human mind. So the major interests of anthropological studies is to understand what kinds of structures are present in this kind of activities of culture, and not the other way around, to try to see cultures as to understand cultures as something that has its own logic. Cultures don't have its own logic. The logic is the logic of the mind. So in a way, they are both, Cassirer and Lévi-Strauss, Kantians. Lévi-Strauss says in a statement that is a transcendental thinker, but without the subject the subject that Kant speaks about. It's just transcendental method to understand the culture. So I think there are lots of points of crossing. Perhaps the difference that I found is in Cassirer, we can speak about, how do we say, an evolution that we can discover between, for instance, the myth and then science. In a way, if I understood well, but perhaps not, science is function itself. We understand finally that the symbol is function. And in myth, we don't see it so well. Lévi-Strauss tries to do a completely different view of myth. He tried to sustain the idea that the myth is not a pre-logical way of thinking. It's a very, very logical way of thinking, but using the tools of the sensor data. I think this is the main difference between those.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Okay, Stefan, you can go ahead.
Sorry, my mouse cursor disappeared. Obviously, thank you very much for this talk, which is obviously touching on things that I also had in mind when giving my talk, and in a way, Star Wars is the Wagner opera, is the ring of, you know, pop culture in a certain way, and even Wagner was pop culture already. And well, but apart from Wagner, the similarities and differences between Cassirer and Lévi-Strauss also seem interesting, because I think there are some interesting differences, and I don't think that these concern the question whether myth or mythology is a logical way of thinking, because I think this is something that Cassirer can give to Lévi-Strauss, in the sense that Cassirer also tries to reconstruct the rationality of the categories used in the mythical modality of consciousness. And I think this is precisely something that then Lévi-Strauss only makes ever more articulate in a great deal of his work. I think that, let me not describe it as advantages or disadvantages, but just a striking difference is that the structuralism of Lévi-Strauss allows to look at these things all on the same plane, as it were, whereas Cassirer is compelled to a more historical, not to say historicist, understanding, where he is always in the quagmire, as it feels, of explaining, okay, there is something that comes first and something comes later, and there is not just, you know, a genetic, but really also a logical priority to some forms and others. And I think that Lévi-Strauss completely discards that idea. However, Lévi-Strauss is then compelled to a kind of relativism that Cassirer can avoid on his account. I mean, just very briefly, very condensed, too condensed, I guess. This seems to me an interesting contrast between the two. And now a figure that mediates between these two positions is Susan Langer. Susan Langer's maybe even a teacher of Lévi-Strauss. I mean, somebody by whom Lévi-Strauss was more influenced than he was by Cassirer, even though they met in New York City and they, you know, both learned from Roman Jacobson, as he was then called, and so on and so forth. So there is a chapter in the history of thought that brings those together. But systematically, I think it is interesting that Langer talked about music as the myth of the inner life. And Langer tried to express the logic of presentational thought, as she calls it, or feeling, through the logic of music. And here she pursues a project that is very much like Cassirer's, but with the means of what Lévi-Strauss will later do. And then again, with the difference that Langer will apply an ever more explicit evolutionism of these forms. So what have I just done? Have I asked a question? I don't think so, but I have tried to complicate the picture of how this relates together. And I guess that Susan Langer's philosophy of music and her philosophy of myth too might be an interesting contrast and complementation to Lévi-Strauss' reading of Wagner.
I agree absolutely with you. In his work, Susan Langer's work, Feeling and Form, she expressed the idea that art is feeling form, and music is for sort the main, perhaps the evident representation that we can connect feelings and forms and give intelligibility, meaning, and also feeling. So I think there is a connection very strong between Susan Langer and Lévi-Strauss. Of course, Lévi-Strauss is also very, what we say, strong influence of Jacobson, the idea of trying to see meaning as something logical positions of contracts and trying to find a mediation. And the myth is, for Lévi-Strauss, is the logical tool that we can try to find the mediations between oppositions. But in general, that kind of mediation doesn't result because there is a real contradiction. But I agree also when he says that we can find in Cassirer a more historical view of the symbol and the myth, not so well in Lévi-Strauss, because for Lévi-Strauss, let me frankly, history is a myth. So he doesn't have a lot of care about history as a science. I said.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? Well, I may also follow up with another then, if that's okay. Just as a brief comment about this discussion between Cassirer and Strauss it's also another interesting line that would be interesting for comparing them is thinking about allegory and tautology. And Cassirer has this very strong, something that I'm working on in my own book right now on Cassirer's philosophy of myth is the way Cassirer says at one point that he wants to take Schelling's metaphysics and make it into a transcendental philosophy. Or he asks, can we take the question in Schelling and make it into a transcendental philosophy? So you have this tautogorical dimension, right? There's really no attempt to really get at the true meaning of a myth. This isn't something or a set of myths. This isn't really what he's interested in. But anyway, I wanted to ask you a question about time in music. It's such an important part of your talk, and I feel like we should address it in the discussion here. This thinking about myth as time becoming space is really fascinating definition, where space is not temporal. So it's a temporal atemporality. You have a kind of, this was mentioned in one of the earlier talks about myth being concerned with, I think in the discussion of Japanese philosophy yesterday, concerned with the eternal past, the ahistorical time, a kind of a non-empirical time. And this came up in a very interesting way, even at the very end of your talk, about how music is a temporal art form, naturally, right? But as you said, it suppresses time. So there's this time, and there's also the negation of time in the very form of it. Like as in myth, we have a kind of atemporal temporality. So I don't know, I was just hoping that you could say a little more about how music suppresses time, and then how that's connected up with the mythological suppression of time.
Music suppresses time because music is a temporal organization of sounds, and the way that organize the sounds is just not to give them just a flow of sounds, is creating paradigms, creating motifs, creating leitmotifs, as Wagner said. So creating a kind of structural organizations of time. I think music is that. In the mythology, we have narratives, and narratives is a temporal language, but the final end of a narrative, mythological, and it's different from all the kinds of narratives. The mythological narrative is a way to show, for Lévi-Strauss, problems that are linked with the human mind, the structure of the human mind, and they are eternal when there is human mind. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thanks. No, yeah, that's so in each case we have a temporal development, we have a temporality, we have temporal contents that are structurally ordered in various ways.
Yes, they are machines, as Lévi-Strauss says, to organize time. It's a way of our thought, to deal with the flow of life. And one of the main questions of Lévi-Strauss is how humankind can solve the split between thought for one side and the flow of life for the other. And the answer is two: myths, but also rituals. The rite is a way of crossing the relationship between the meanings, the thoughts, and the life itself, the flow of life. So when we do a rite, we establish connections between those of this situation. And I think when we go to a concerto and listen to it, it's the same way. We are listening to music, but we are participating in it. We are not split from it. We participate with all kinds of our body, our mind, our so even if we are quiet in the concert, and we must be quiet.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Also, following upon Stefan's presentation, to think about also in connection with Levi-Strauss and Wagner, the connection between myth and aesthetic experience here, and to
Yes.
think about your talks together, one through Cassirer, the other through Strauss. That's
One of
interesting.
One of the main concepts of Levi-Strauss is mythème en français,
Right.
in French. Mythème. Mythème is a mythical phrase, and it tries to establish, like a puzzle, to establish links and the connections between them. And in Wagner, we find also a puzzle of motifs, musical motifs, and Wagner tries to establish connections between them. And as Levi-Strauss says, it can give other meanings to the story that we don't understand clearly. So we understand in a way unconscious. We understand it in our unconscious. It's not something that is expressed like conscious thesis. In a way, if I can link with the idea that I spoke with you in our other day, I think both of them, Levi-Strauss and Wagner, as the idea that the artistic creation is a representation of imagination that can make lots of thoughts, but doesn't connect with a single concept. So, in a way, is a transcendental way that Kant has established in Critique of Power of Judgment when he speaks about aesthetic idea. I think it's one of the greatest ideas of Kant. For Kant, as you know, is poetry, the main expression of this kind. For Levi-Strauss, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche is music. Because it speaks about, because it goes from unconscious, not from the rational.
Very interesting. A lot to think about here. So, any final questions or comments before we sign off and take a break? Okay. Well, thank you once again, Carlos, for your talk. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Very stimulating. And we'll come back together in 30 minutes at about 8 o'clock, and we will make the transition to Nietzsche. So we'll on to Nietzsche. So I'm excited for that. Okay. See you all soon.